All right, welcome. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're excited. Kim's ready to move to the next phase of her career. So I'm going to talk about the committee, our jurors, and then just the process that we're going to follow this morning. So I want to welcome Bob Ziebert. He is actually the landowner for the property that Kim is looking at. She'll talk a little bit more about that. And so he's a local developer and actually has a couple of folks probably joining today that are involved in the development and excited to hear about the potential alternative vision for this property. And Carl Wallach is a professor at UWM in architecture. He's the other committee member. So we've been working with Kim throughout the semester. For those of you who are new to this process, I worked with Kim in the fall, so she does one semester of pre-thesis developing the concept of what she's going to focus on, and then one semester on design. We have several visiting folks today. So we have Sarah Lampin. She's head of architecture at Queen's University in Belfast. If you want to wave, Sarah. She's also co-director of the research group Recomposing the City. We have Scott Pollack joining us. He's owner of Pollack Architecture in Oldenburg, Germany. He's also an adjunct professor at Jade University, so adjunct professor for design. We have Joy Erdman. She is associate professor in architectural design at James Madison University and also an architect and principal with Roots. Finally, we have Mark Keene. He's from SARUP, professor in architecture at UW-Milwaukee. He just completed a studio on zero net energy, as well as he has some experience in a similar kind of project, but he focused more on the residential architecture that was for Prairie Crossing in Illinois. And so the process we're going to do is Kim will present her thesis project. I will then take a couple comments from the committee members, Bob and Carl, just reactions. Then I will move to the guest jurors. But I want to invite everybody to find their chat button at the bottom and feel free throughout the presentation to type in comments, questions, particularly at the end. And this ranges from family members saying, "Great job, Kim," to people asking technical questions. And I will read those as we get into the discussion. So if there are no questions, Kim, I'm going to pass it to you.
Okay. Yeah, well, thank you everyone for coming today. So my name is Kim Albrecht and I'm a joint master's student and I am doing the urban planning and architecture program. So this project kind of blends both worlds into one. And I'm going to share my screen, so I unfortunately won't be able to see any of you in the video because that would block the screen, but I'll go ahead and share my screen with you now. If I can pull it up.
We've done this many times, so
Yes.
I know it'll work. Yeah.
Okay. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes, I can.
Okay.
Yeah.
Full screen, and then I'm going to hide these video boxes, so then you won't see these black boxes on the screen. Okay, so does everyone just see the screen?
Mm-hmm.
The project. Okay. So about a year ago, Bob Ziebert, as Carolyn mentioned, approached me with this 52-acre parcel in the town of Beloit. Is essentially right now it's just a blank slate, and he asked my opinion of what we could do on this site. And so I immediately started researching rural development models, and I came across the agrihood development model, which is a model that seeks to connect people with the environment by providing recreation and educational opportunities right in their backyard. So the ultimate goal of this project is to essentially utilize design strategies that create that sense of community for people living there, and then also serve visitors that can come to the site to use as a destination for the region. Okay, so the agrihood concept, or the term, is relatively new. It was coined in 2014, but the concept can be traced back to the 1800s. But essentially an agrihood is a community-based housing model that is centered around a working farm with recreation and educational amenities. So essentially there are 200 of these projects over the United States, and it seems to be a trend that's continually growing and thriving. It is important to note that these projects don't just take place in warm climates like the example shown in Florida, Texas, and California, but one of the most well-known agri-hood sites is actually Prairie Crossing in Illinois, which Carolyn had just mentioned. And it takes a minute to go to the next slide, I guess. Okay. So this is the study area we're looking at. The site is in the town of Beloit with that border on the northern end, and then the city of Beloit shown on the southern end. And the site can actually be almost entirely surrounded by the city, so these more dense environments, and then conveniently located right on the Rock River. So it's a unique opportunity for this site to have amenities on the water, and then also be accessible to people in the town and the city. So why this could work on this potential site. So the city of Beloit has undergone a variety of residential, commercial, and industrial redevelopment projects over the past decades, particularly thanks to the Hendricks family, who has put in a lot of time and money and effort into really shifting the identity of downtown Beloit and the city of Beloit. Just recently, a $405 million casino project was approved in the city of Beloit that is supposed to create 1,500 new jobs. The revitalized Ironworks campus was thanks to the Hendricks family, in which they purchased the old abandoned foundry building and created retail and small businesses that is now home to 1,000 employees. And the new Snapper Stadium, so that's a single A affiliate MLB stadium that just got approval this past year. It'll be built, construction will start soon. And then the last image is showing Riverside Park, which is a nice park right on the river that has been updated with a different amount of amenities, and to show that there is that demand for outdoor recreation in the city of Beloit. So this is an aerial view of the site just to get oriented. It's kind of divided into two parcels, one being the area towards the river, and the area above is currently used as farmland. So it's essentially 52 acres, and I wanted to point out two things. Where that white dotted line is a dramatic change in elevation as you move towards the river, but then it flattens out again. So right now it's kind of a bluff area. And then the two vertical lines running through the site are existing tree lines that largely shape the design of the site. So just a quick diagram showing changes in topography. So on the left parcel is a gradual sloping down from right to left. And there's, if you can see my cursor, kind of this is where the water flows down through the site. And there's been some flooding issues here. So we kind of propose some natural filtration systems to mitigate potential flooding on the site. And then in the right section here, we have that dramatic change in elevation starting here. It's completely flat up here, and then it drops off rather quickly until it levels out again towards the river. Just quickly, I wanted to point out how close the site is to major arterials and highways. It's just 6 miles from the I-90, I-43 interchange, so it's readily accessible by car. And then also pointing out the existing bike lanes and bike paths. Almost the entire way is connected by bike paths from downtown Beloit to the site, except for about a 2-block stretch. And then showing that green line on South Afton Road here, this bike lane actually goes all the way to the city of Janesville. So the site's pretty connected by bike and car, but it creates some problems in terms of walking for pedestrians, since there's not a lot of sidewalks nearby. So this is the first set of diagrams kind of going through site design, kind of exploring different options that are widely different from one another, and eventually how it evolved to reach the final design called Dovetail that we further refined and detailed for the final product of the design. I'll go through them really quickly. So the first one is the traditional development, essentially having, houses back to back, larger lot sizes, a lot of road access points. And then, so this one yields the most housing units with single family homes of 60 and townhomes of 16. but the least amount of farmland at 5.3 acres. And then comments early on kind of related to this one of seeing that disconnect between the community amenities here and that in this area here and the farming with the housing. So that's something that we wanted to change and make sure that they were integrated. So Edge is the next design that started to do that around the border and having those views towards the growing areas, but that the way the housing is set up, it kind of disconnects people, the public, from the site and kind of makes it feel more private. And that's something we wanted to avoid, kind of opening up the site. The next one being linear, produce the most area for farmland, but the least amount of housing. And then again, kind of having a disconnect between your neighbors as they're just in lines and separated by the growing areas. And circles started to blend agricultural and housing development, having it both in the front of houses and in the back. But then again, kind of having that barrier around, so it didn't seem as accessible to the public. So Dovetail is the one that was chosen to move forward with, and it created the best balance between agriculture, recreation, and housing. So this one, it changes a little bit moving forward, but 56 families, single family homes, 14 townhomes, and almost 20 acres of farmland. So it's kind of the best of both. So this is a more refined site plan. Going through it, I'll go through it briefly and then you'll see a different view. But having the housing, pairs of housing with kind of growing areas in between each node, and having two different types of growing areas, one being taller row crops shown in these green areas, and then smaller row crops shown in these areas between the housing. And with the larger row crops kind of in the middle, is more accessible for larger equipment. And then moving on towards the river, there's more of a conventional park space with outlooks looking out to the river. In this design, there's 42 single family homes, 10 townhomes that could be divided into 2 units, 23 acres of agricultural land, a large network of a multi-use trail system for bikes and pedestrians, and then a 9,000 square foot community hub building located here that is meant to be used by residents and the public. So this is a land and programming distribution kind of guide showing that the areas in purple are all the housing, areas in green be open space and growing areas, dark blue being the community hub there in the center of the site, and then the light blue being waterfront access. And each kind of node and category has its own programmatic opportunities, but also these programs are meant to be fluid with one another and kind of flow throughout the site. So this is an aerial view of the site to kind of give you an idea of scale and the different growing areas between the housing and how these amenities interact with one another and transition from one area to the next. So there's certain things I wanted to call out on this map. First of all, we talked about how the stormwater travels down this way. Having bioswales lining the streets is a way to collect stormwater and have it soak into the ground before entering the sewer system. And then the smaller row crops would be smaller vegetables like lettuce and carrots and beets and stuff like that, so that you can preserve the views in between homes. And then larger row crops like corn or maybe wheat, depending on the year, in these central areas that are larger areas and not as easily done by hand, and while the small row crops are easily done by hand. And then this is an image showing what the townhomes could look like in kind of matching the aesthetic of that community hub that we will get to. Having an outdoor stage area, somewhere you could host concerts, summer concert series, really drawing in people from outside of the community. And then on the river, having kayak and boat launches gives the people the way to not only access the site, but to also have those recreation opportunities. And then in areas that aren't conducive to growing, crops. We have native prairie grasses kind of surrounding that park area. And then lastly, the community space that will get more detailed, that I call the barn, is where you can host a variety of events and farmers markets and a place for the community to enjoy, and also people within the area. So now it's moving into kind of the human scale of the project, starting to look at how the housing interacts with these more natural elements. Having this multi-use trail, there's a distinction between having the multi-use trail and the sidewalks. Sidewalks being only 5 feet wide, and the multi-use trail being 8, but being made with crushed red granite that's more porous, but is able to be maintained throughout the winter. So that's meant for bikers and pedestrians, joggers. And then being lined, each trail throughout the site is either lined with bioswale, prairie grasses, trees, or growing areas. So this is a view of someone sitting in their backyard, kind of taking in the environment and enjoying being outside, encouraging people to get outside and to talk to their neighbors and to share those common experiences with learning how to grow and watching things grow. And actually having that, seeing the townhomes and the other homes in the community hub in the distance while just watching, people pass on the trail, biking or walking, kind of encouraging people to interact with one another. So this is a view from the more conventional park space with a large lawn area outside of the outdoor stage area. So you could have a wide variety of events there. Overlooking onto the river, and there's these outlook points on the corners here to have those views of the river being unobstructed by trees. And then a playground area for kids. So kind of have a variety of experiences here. This is a multi-use trail view with the larger row crops on the right and the smaller row crops on the left. And again, being immersed in that environment and learning about the agricultural practices going on there. So now we move into the building itself. This is called the community hub or the barn. And this is a basic first floor plan with the second floor being a loft space. But starting down in this area here being a large gathering space where you could host farmers markets in the colder months, and also wedding receptions and stuff like that, classroom space, exhibition space, whatever you may want to do. Kind of the main goal of this building was to make it as flexible as possible so it could be used for a variety of activities. And then having a kitchen area here where you could teach people how to grow or to cook the food that they have grown on site, and then serve this area here with these windows being connected to those gathering spaces. And then lastly, showing the tractors and having that equipment being visible to people that are within the building is to get them interested in that site, but it could also be used as a live demonstration area where people can learn how to use the equipment and repair it. So kind of getting people really involved in the whole agricultural process. And then to the right is the circulation corridor, which essentially functions as a screened-in porch and has operable doors on different parts of the corridor. And lastly, we have an outdoor patio space where you could host larger outdoor events. And then having permanent furniture for bonfire pits and seating, but then also being able to bring in picnic tables or stuff like that to have more seating options. And then the biggest key here is also to have this circulation space being able to view the growing areas looking out. So this is a section cut directly through the middle of the building, looking at kind of that storage area here with equipment, but having that lofted space above so you can have those views down into the and to observe the live demonstrations going on in that area, and then the small gathering spaces connected with the large gathering space with views towards the growing areas. So this section is cut through the kitchen. Again, like I said, the kitchen could be used for teaching classes, but also farm to table dining. And then having the trail, the multi-use trail running through the front, for the front of the building. And then having the lofted space above with the corridor space on the right. And then moving on to the patio where you could have a variety of furniture for different occasions. And then looking out into the growing areas with the townhouses in the distance. So this is an interior view of that large gathering space. Right now it's shown as being hosting a farmer's market. Again, it could be used for a variety of different activities, but essentially having that connection between the interior and the environment is the big key in this space. This is that corridor that's essentially a screened-in porch, but these lattice systems could open depending on time of year or if you want more wind in through the building. And then having those views into the equipment storage space and then the views towards the growing areas outside. So this is the front of the building. This is the first thing you would see coming onto the site. Essentially, the orientation of the building was meant to kind of serve as a gateway to the site, with the large gathering space being the focal point as you drive in through that main street, and being a space that you can use different times of day and every time and different times of year. So something that's essentially a huge space for a variety of activities. So this last perspective is a view of from the growing areas looking at the building. Again, showing how those screens could be opened up to provide more views and natural ventilation through the building. And just to showcase how much activity is going on and how you can be exposed to these types of activities at all times on this site. So essentially the biggest idea was to focus on how to make this site outside the status quo. How can we make this not a traditional development type where you see, like on the left here, you'll see cul-de-sacs, lack of shared spaces, maybe a sidewalk here and there, houses back to back or fenced in. So there's really no connection with your neighbors. There's no shared experiences. But with this design, it is meant to create that sense of community by connecting people to their neighbors and also connecting them to the environment. So that's it.
Okay, thank you. Yay, we're all clapping. Yes. I'm excited because you've talked a lot about the different scales of community, and you've been able to illustrate from a growing aspect of community engagement and education right down to the community building. So Kim, just be aware as you're turning back on so you can see us, that it will cover some of your images as we have a dialogue. So you'll probably need to move some of those.
I don't know how to, did that help?
Or you can exit out of full screen. I don't know if that will matter at this point, but otherwise I think you might need to just listen to us and not see us.
Okay.
That might be okay.
All right, I can put it back the way it was.
Okay. All right, so I want to start with Bob, since again, you're the landowner, you were looking for a different vision. We've been pushing her quite a bit. What's your reaction and some thoughts?
Well, first of all, congratulations, Kim, on a superb job. I think from a Beloit community standpoint, you really hit a lot of the marks as far as what could be a really exciting project in Beloit. The idea of having a community with connection to agriculture fits well to the farmers market that we have in town. It's a huge draw, so people are very connected to local farmers. The usable riverfront is really something else. Again, when I first thought about this right away, I go right to the traditional neighborhood. You're going to roll up a bunch of houses on the riverfront, and go with that plan. But to see how this can be all connected, so the residents and the community has access to the riverfront is really awesome.
Well, thank you, Bob.
And one final thing, personally, it's a place where I'd want to live. I had no idea where this was going, but to be able to have exposure to an agriculture environment with a low maintenance, smaller lot, yet having a lot of more public area to enjoy, and yet still have the utilities, sewer, water, electricity, and in these days, you know, internet in town that you can utilize it while still enjoying that outdoor agriculture feel, I think is just really outstanding. So I'm very excited about it. Thank you, Kim.
Well, thank you.
Before we move on to Carl, there is just one question. I know you addressed stormwater management and we talked a little bit about flow. Could you just highlight how you imagine stormwater would be managed and then the locations for some of those elements? You can use a site plan, I think.
Okay. Yeah, so as I mentioned, the site gradually slopes down this way. So I have these beds here or along this trail and the beds here along the road here. So as it flows downwards, collected here, and then being able to, well, it's a divot, so then it would be able to collect a lot of the water and then have it naturally soak into the ground before, when also filtrating it and then before releasing it into the sewer system.
Yeah, so there were a series of bioswales. Nancy had asked specifically about this. It showed up, I think, in your section, but you didn't focus on it in some of your other renderings. We lost Carl. He's coming back on. Yes, this is being recorded for those who are asking. So while we're waiting for Carl to jump back on, I'll just make some of my comments. I think overall, it's an excellent example of creating public and semi-public spaces so that this actually will feel welcoming. I think Bob hit it with the river. I think I struggled with the river initially because it was so wooded and it was mostly the scrub trees. Like, how could you give access? So creating opportunities, not just for those who live in the neighborhood, but for those who are looking for a different experience, could ride their bike out here. It's really quite accessible. And given all of the COVID-19 experiences we're in the middle of, this provides a lot of opportunity to social distance, right? You would have public spaces. I could experience the environment while still being quarantined at home. And so it's a different way that we weren't thinking at the beginning of the semester, but it addresses a lot of those elements. And from a building scale, I think you did a really good job also with your screen feature that really was driving a lot of that design of the wall section, or not sections, but the walls and the screening, but creating a more flexible space. And I can imagine a lot of different activities occurring there. And I think adding value overall to this development, so from a feasibility development perspective, it might have fewer units than a more traditional layout, but I think there's a lot of studies out there. I looked at this years ago, whether it was in the Madison area or Prairie Crossing, the value per lot in overall development will be actually much higher because of your access to public space. And you had 79% that isn't development. So 79% of that site is accessible to everyone. So we'll see if Carl is back. Carl, are you here?
It works. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great job, Kim, and very thorough presentation, and the graphics are very clear. So I know you've been working really hard, and it definitely shows. I think for me, my biggest question is, can it be like even? I know you're kind of limited to this particular parcel, and I found some of the images that you were showing, compelling enough that I wish that this could be even more extensive as a kind of a development system rather than just one little pocket in one area. So I guess. I don't know, maybe it's more of a question to people that are financing this or ultimately running it. Is something like this actually viable rather than having areas that are, only for agricultural, areas that are only for residential, areas that are only for kind of urban development? You've got a little bit of mix of all of them together. And to me, the hybrid, I find really compelling. So maybe I just am curious to hear what others have to say about the viability of something like this. Because I would like to go there. I would like to live there.
Okay, I'm going to move on to our guesters, and then along the way, I think as you answer questions, Kim, there's been a couple questions about, are the public areas really public? And you can talk about that experience. So Sarah, we'll start with you for some of your feedback, questions, or comments for Kim.
Kim, thanks very much for sharing that with us. It's so very different than what I'm now used to. So it's a great educational experience for me to think about things like this. I wonder if you could go back a few steps, and maybe this is mainly first semester work that you did, so apologies if I'm treading over old ground, but the Agri-Hood development you said it was from about 2014, isn't that right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay. So I was just wondering if you had any, or if there is any critique of the Agri-Hood development pattern, even though it's only, say, 6 years old, and what kind of thoughts you had about that critique, or if you looked at a lot of Agri-Hoods, what kind of comments and critique did you have about those that are already existing?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think the biggest critique I have is having these spaces, like someone who just mentioned, that some of these public spaces don't feel public. I had went to the Agri-Hood in the town of Mukwonago that is almost finished being built, but they have a barn area, but the road towards the barn says private drive, no access. So you can't even really go into that space that's meant to be a community space. And then the houses are all just set up in a cul-de-sac. So it's essentially just typical development, but called an Agri-Hood. But then you have different examples of projects like Agritopia is a very unique project in Arizona where they combine housing, retail, community spaces, and residential in different residential units that make it feel more public, especially with the retail element being involved. So it depends, it really varies from project to project, but I think the biggest critique I have is making sure that those public spaces are actually open to the public and not the people that just live there.
Okay. So I think, again, you guys have already submitted your portfolios, it sounds like, but I think that's something to emphasize, that you haven't just taken the notion of the Agri-Hood and just sort of not critiqued it, not thought about it, not tried to think of it an alternative means of rolling it out. That, every time we make a development like this, which is, this would be an enormous investment for your client, and also, the fact that it would change the environment so much. I think that's a really important thing to stress, particularly at master's level, that, you're constantly critiquing things that have come before. I think there's also issues, again, for me, this density is incredibly low. So where I live, you just wouldn't build anything like this. And I don't just mean the fact that you're giving over so much to public space or growing space. I mean, the sizes of the houses and the sizes of the individual plots. So obviously you're working within a market system and you're working for a real client, which is extremely useful. But I wonder if you could say anything about radicalizing this, like what would you have done if you weren't having to stick to financial constraints or feasibility? What would you have approached this in any different way? Would you have built a tower for all the residences, or did you think about did you think about it in that sort of a way?
Not entirely, just because I was, I guess, so focused on this site, and it's the density in the area is very low. Even just in Rock County, the density is like 224 people per square mile, so it's fairly low. But I guess in a different context, that could be feasible. But also, in every project I've looked at, even if it's 5 minutes outside of San Antonio, the density is actually similar to this. There might be more housing units just because the site is bigger, but really none of them focus on different housing types in that regard, or using a tower or something more dense. Most of them are kind of single family homes, maybe a few apartments or townhomes, but I haven't seen anything like that. Is something to definitely think about, but I guess in the context of this site, this is what made sense for the surrounding area.
I think, again, it's just kind of that notion of because you're in an educational environment, and these are the kind of places where you can experiment. You can be quite our students say wacky all the time, but this kind of thinking about things in a very unconventional way. And what if that were to would you be able to yield a lot more food, would you be able to yield more public space? Would you be able to yield better CO2 absorption, all those kinds of things within the site? Maybe I'll let somebody else talk. I have some questions about sustainability and things, but maybe I'll let one of the other guest critics have some words.
Okay, well, we'll come back and I'll be reading the questions. There's a couple questions coming in as well. Let's move on to Scott. Why don't you give us your thoughts as you're enjoying the outdoors, right?
Yes, it's nice. Well, yeah, and especially for this project as well. I mean, I find it a very interesting combination of trying to approach this idea of sprawl, but giving it sort of an agricultural note. I find it really intriguing. It's also interesting to hear about the density that there is out there in Beloit. I'm unfamiliar with the area, although I did grow up in Wisconsin. But I like this idea of the agricultural communities. I didn't realize that this was something that's actually going on over there in quite this kind of development. But it's curious to me. I guess I can also say the same thing over here. We wouldn't necessarily plan with this type of low density, but I can totally understand where it's attractive, especially looking at the page here and or at the screen and seeing the traditional neighborhood development versus what a community could be. I don't know if I missed it at the beginning, but I'm curious, who's cultivating the fields, Kim?
Yeah, so that's actually there's a variety of options, and that would kind of be decided case by case basis. But there's kind of three main methods that people use to take care of the fields, and one being they hire a professional farmer to manage the site. Two would be to create a nonprofit organization, which is something that's very common, and then also having a for-profit organization. So it really depends on what you want to do and how much farmland you actually have. Like an example of Agritopia, they only have 11 acres of organic farmland, but they have a for-profit organization because their retail component is so strong. So it really depends on what the developer wants to do in the situation.
Okay, I'm curious because at least I'm over here in northern Germany, and especially where we are now, and strangely enough, over the past couple of weeks, the last 6 weeks, all of us have been in lockdown. One of the most staple, well, how do we say it? I haven't been speaking English that much today. One of the most consistent, there we go. One of the most consistent things that we were able to rely on over here. Not that this should happen in the future for everyone, of course, but one of the most consistent things we were able to rely on were the farmers markets, and I found that it was great. Not only did it allow everyone to get out, of course, with their social distancing practices and all of that, masks and all, in the 2 meters or 6 feet or whatever, but I found that was something that was really interesting here. They're all local farmers that are here from around the area. And they come in and bring their crops in, and I could potentially say we're probably similar in a sense to maybe what Beloit is, because we're relatively provincial, and so there are quite a lot of farming communities or farmers around. I like this idea, and that's why I was interested in it. That there's actually a sort of a connection between the people and the crops, and I think it would be a really strong sort of message if the opportunities for maybe a farmer or someone who's farming on a smaller scale, maybe on a larger scale, could be able to see some type of potential of purchasing a home and working maybe some of the crops. I mean, I know if it comes in from outside, it's one thing. But it's also a method of distancing the people who live there from what they're enjoying at the same. And so, I think this idea of the integration, not only in the community and the crops and what may be done there should be. I think it would be very effective for what maybe Beloit has to offer, if there were in some way, shape, or form maybe community in the community that dealt with those kinds of things. I mean, they do that in a lot of urban places with urban farming, etc. But that it may not for the future when this if this may be developed, or if it, or when it is developed, that there's some type of community integration, not only just being a part of the space and being able to explore the space and use it, but to cultivate the space and use that kind of one-to-one connection. But I think it's quite an interesting concept. That, like I said, one that wouldn't necessarily work well over here. At least we'd have to get someone like Bob, who has a little bit more vision than some of the people that are a little bit more money hungry over here, that just buy up land and put neighborhoods on them, just like they do back in the States. But yeah, I think this idea of integrating the cultivation of land and the people who live there would be really, really strong.
Okay, thanks, Scott. I'm going to move on to Jory. You want to provide some of your thoughts or questions?
Yes. First of all, thank you, Kim, for doing such a wonderful presentation. Really, really well done. Very, I don't want to say professional, but it's very professional. I don't mean that as like it's cold. It's not cold. It's just really, really well executed, well done, well crafted. That's a better word. I do have some questions ranging from the overall, or comments ranging from the sort of overall prospect of this to the like smaller details of the architectural execution of things. But so first of all, I actually hadn't been aware of this typology coming into the development world, which is really fascinating and interesting. And I'm in Charlottesville, Virginia right now, and I think we're probably getting too far past our density to do things like this, but it's definitely something that people are really interested in right now. I think, sort of people coming into middle age or younger people are very interested in sort of where their food comes from, and the whole lineup of how our food is produced. And as we're thinking about shortages now, because our whole world is kind of flipped these days, which leads me to a couple of my questions. So for me, there's an interesting, I guess I want to know more. And you're kind of at a disadvantage because I can't dig into each. I can't go back to your drawings and look at each one to see if you've done this or not. So you can correct me if I'm wrong. But I think that relationship now that we're becoming acutely aware of, being sort of quarantined in our own homes, is like the limitations of the way we live right now and the benefits of spending a lot of time in our houses, and the way that people relate to one another. Like, I live on a little cul-de-sac, and instead of like, it's not a circle with like asphalt in the middle, it's actually a circle with a little green in the middle of it. And it's just become like this hangout spot for the kids and the moms with their wine in the evening. And, they're, people are keeping socially distanced, but it has become a place where we all, because it is it's pretty dense where I live. It's single houses, but they're really close together. And so that shared space is really, has become taken on extra importance right now. And I've known when my kids were littler and we lived in a neighborhood that was just a street, like we would put out cones in the middle of the street to block things off. And so I think people really want that shared relationship to each other. So I guess I'd want to kind of like dig into each one of these houses and see how it relates to the neighbor across the street. And is there a sidewalk leading out? Is there public outdoor space? Not public, but the semi-private kind of porch area where people can hang out and have barbecues, because we're going to move past this where we all can't get together anymore eventually, but where people can really build that sense of community that you're talking about. And I appreciate the challenge of wanting some of those houses to face onto the main roads rather than in looking interior. Like that's like a tension that you had to wrestle with, I'm sure, a lot of. Obviously you showed us different examples of how you're trying to address that. So that front yard backyard relationship is just, I guess I would like to know more. And that's like, this is a super complex, big, humongous task that you've taken on. So it's more of just you know, as you continue to develop these ideas, I'm sure it's going to stick with you for a long time, as they are supposed to do with these thesis projects. Thinking about how that works. I've been in some neighborhoods, some planned communities that are really nice, where you have like the street where everybody comes in, and that's kind of how people identify. But then in between the backyards of people are huge parks and walkways and playgrounds and schools that connect people. And so I just think that that relationship is really interesting. It really limits your private space as an individual family. So that, you know, it's a tricky balancing act. And of course, like, that's why people live in different neighborhoods, because they prefer different levels of privacy to a certain extent. So that's one of my big questions. The other question, and then I'll stop talking. I have a couple others, but like Sarah, I'll shut up for a minute. But is the architecture of the central building. I did find when you got to the perspective with the peaked roof in it, I all of a sudden realized what was so familiar about it was that it looks like a country church to me. So it has a kind of ecclesiastical dimension and proportion or something that I think, you know, is that what you want or not what you want? I just think it's a question. And so my perception, just looking at it, I'm just offering that up to you to think about, you know, is that the kind of, I mean, you know, it draws on some of our perceptions of spaces, but I'm not sure that's what you want, or maybe it is.
Yeah, so I'll go back, I guess, to your first question. Like you said, it was a back and forth of kind of trying to decide the growing areas being visible from the front yard versus the backyard. Yeah.
Kim, as you're talking about, show the perspectives that I think relate to Jory's comments. One is from the porch and one will be your building. I know there's a lot, you keep talking while it's lagging, but there, yeah. Oh yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so personally, I think what it came down to actually was personally how I interact with spaces and people close to me is that I personally prefer hanging out in the backyard instead of being on the street side, just because it's usually quieter. And then so having that space to enjoy kind of the crops, being focused in the backyard was a conscious choice. Just because it just feels more safer, I guess I would say, and more secluded, but also more peaceful is what it came down to. But then being able to walk out your front door, say you're on your front porch, you can still see those areas maybe across the street. Is as close as it gets for that, or the pieces in between the nodes, like this area here is visible from the front as well, not looking straight out, but essentially it was a decision to kind of have those areas visible from the back. And then also, did I answer that question, or should I keep going?
No, that makes sense. I know, just looking at that backyard perspective, like my kids and the kids in our neighborhood would be tromping on every crop there, running to get their ball and chase each other. And
yeah, that is.
You can't do everything. You can't do everything in these things. It's a great project.
Yeah, maintaining the crops would be, I mean, it's really important of how they look as well. Obviously, they're shown here is, you know, being in good shape. If you can't always control how they're going to grow and people stepping on them. Hopefully I usually put at least a buffer between the trails, a little bit of a buffer between the trails and the crops, so you're not stepping on them or stuff like that immediately.
I think it makes the pathways really important though, you know, the smaller scale pathways. Like, I feel like this whole thing would have like a really strong network of, you know, the sneaky paths that kids would take to cut between things and move around, and that everybody would take just to, you know, to get around.
I think the scale of her pass is also critical. There were a couple of questions about 8 foot versus 10 foot. In my practice, the only time I've used 10-foot trails is when I have to use Department of Transportation funding and they require 10 foot, but 8 foot is, I think, a more appropriate scale for this. That's how wide a parking stall is, and so you can have easily people running in either direction. So I think that scale And then as we move on, I know we have only about less than 10 minutes left. I want to have Mark make some comments. There's been some questions about the irrigation, Kim, and we did talk about that. Those smaller crops, could you use water from the houses? So if you might want to address that as well.
Yeah, so initially I would say kind of those smaller row crop areas I talked to somebody that the person that runs Cream City Farms, and his property is about an acre. And he waters everything by hand, literally takes out a hose and waters by that area. And so all these kind of smaller growing areas are less than an acre. And there's a part of something where you could have people in the community actually do this. Part of a homeowners association, they'll charge, $60 a year to have your own piece of land that you're responsible for to take care of. So you really could have people living in that home take care of those crops right around their home fairly easy, especially because they're less than a half an acre. And then with the larger areas, I would imagine doing some type of larger scale irrigation system, but being able to collect stormwater off the roof would be a good option of the houses and the main community space. I would talk to the person, it was at Prairie Crossing, I believe. They have a large detention pond that they use to water their crops. So I guess it really depends on the situation and how you want to do it, but it is doable by hand in certain areas. But it's if you have the people that are willing to do it and the time to do it.
Okay, Mark, I'm going to move to you. I know I'm trying to watch the time before Mo closes us out here. Is Mark still with us? Let me take a peek.
Still with you. Here I am.
Okay, there you are. Okay, I'm just going to look if you're on mute. Okay.
Okay, so great project, very thorough, very adventurous, showing lots of different ideas. I've never heard of an agri-hood before. I think back when I was involved with Prairie Crossing or Middleton Hills, they were called conservation communities. So maybe the language is changing, shifting around. I know Prairie Crossing has a dedicated farmer that lives on site, so there's sort of a different aspect of having the people not actually engaged in the farming per se. Maybe there's some volunteer work, some separation there. This is probably getting back to Sarah's point about maybe talking a bit about sustainability. The sort of the discussion around that is the nexus of energy, food, and water. And obviously, you're all over the food and the water, but I think energy-wise, that would kind of complete the triumvirate if, for instance, I would take what we're looking at now on the screen, I'd rotate it 90 degrees to get the greatest full southern exposure, and I'd simply create enormous PV arrays. Yeah. So this type of site, because it's so adventurous in some of the other aspects, it seems like it's lagging in terms of energy performance, and that's something very easy to do in this day and age.
Right.
When you talked about how you develop the site plan itself, and that's obviously the key image for all the project because it links everything together, you mentioned being responsive to the hedgerows, the sort of north-south axis, sort of the history of the land, which is a great idea. PC did that too. I think that type of stuff, that type of response to the land is really important. And yet you kind of rendered it like it's a fresh crop of trees. I would have made that a little more softer, a little more exploratory, and let the actual ebb and flow of that 120-year-old hedgerow show itself in your diagramming. Because for me, looking at your site plan there, I'm attracted to the romance of the river edge, and it seems brittle when you go back to where we're living and farming. I think you can nuance the whole thing and make it much more exploratory and much softer in terms of, the farm doesn't have to be quite so rigid, the backyards don't, and so forth, just to kind of soften the whole schema. Another point I wanted to make too, and maybe you and Bob have gone through this in terms of what the market can bear, but we're learning that now we've done a couple of these in the Midwest. Now we're down in Racine because now data is driving a lot of our decisions, where they realize that Racine County is one of the third largest metropolitan area in the state, and yet they're eighth in the amount of affordable housing for the people that live there. So that marketplace, it seems like you're catering kind of monolithically. like a stratum across society. The same type of people have to move here because the footprint of everything is kind of similar, as opposed to maybe what the Congress of Urbanism now talks about, the missing middle. We do great with single families, we do great with multifamily and towers and things. We're missing duplexes, smaller rental properties, quad things, so people can start out of college, start with new families, and get into these homes. Because I think right now you might be pricing yourself out of entry market level just by the size and scale of things. And so maybe working with a marketing firm that deals with homeowners, you'd find a way to get more of a plurality across your site. Other than that, I think it was really well done, really articulated, and a lot of great points you brought up by other jurors in terms of possibilities of this down the road.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks for everybody. I think, am I echoing here?
A little bit.
We'll see how long that lasts. So I know Will's going to have us move off in a second here, but I want to thank everybody. I think sustainability is really important. That could be the next element of the building energy efficiency. I know on the train through northern Germany a couple summers ago, I was struck by all the barns with solar panels, right? So
yeah, they have plenty of them here. Yeah.
So I think we're all echoing now. And so there's been a couple of questions about what happens next, and working with Bob and seeing how flexible everybody is in the Beloit area. This could go further, right? I think it's that next conversation. I'm really, is everybody hearing the echo?
Yeah.
Okay, this must be a Zoom thing because I know we're all echoing. Since that's going to get a little annoying, I'm going to probably close this out, but I want to thank the committee, thank Kim for all your work. And I think Bob and Carl, right, for all the effort on this. And I think you still, if you wanted to make any revisions, you have a couple comments of how you could expand this. Okay.
Yeah, I appreciate all the feedback and all your help. So thank you for being here.
Well done, Kim.
Yeah, well done, and good luck.
Thanks to all the guesters and for enjoying the rest of your time looking at the SARUP projects. Yes, congratulations, Kim.
Thank you.
Congratulations. Glad to have seen what you did.
Good job, Kim.
Good job, Kim. Thanks for kicking us off this morning.
Yeah, sounds good. Thank you.
Brittany, you want to take it away?
Yeah, definitely. All right. Good morning and hi, everyone. My name is Britani Bahr, and I am a 3-year graduate student. And I just want to thank everyone for coming today. I'm going to attach a link to my website down here below in the chat if everyone can see that. And I invite everyone to check out my website after my presentation just for better resolution. But I do ask that everyone follows along on the Zoom screen as I will be navigating you through the entire site. And I'm going to share my screen here with you all. All right. What would it be like if humans perceived the world with a biocentric view? More specifically, what would this look like for architecture? As it currently stands, everything revolves around human perception and thinking. Instead of viewing a place as mutual territory for every existing organism, we question how it will be used and interacted only by humans. Architecture is no different. The core of the built environment is based on the efficiency and the study at the human scale, with the purpose of creating a safe, comfortable, and inspiring habitat for mankind. But what happens when the focus shifts towards wildlife, their natural habitat, and their social interactions with humans? In what ways can we design to create an educational experience and obscure the gradient between wildlife and humans? This thesis will explore wildlife habitat that has become urbanized and how it can be restored to an ecosystem where wildlife and humans can live amongst one another. By creating a coexisting habitat for wildlife and humans, we can learn how to create positive interactions and observe the species in their native habitats. Creating a coexisting habitat for mankind and animals is critical in the evolution of wildlife as urban cities continue to grow. This thesis will look at the Henry Meyer Festival grounds located in Milwaukee, Wisconsin as a site, and the image you are viewing is a collage of the site with layered sandboard maps upon one another, giving an introduction to the site's history and evolving conditions. More specifically, this thesis explores the Children's Zone area, which is on the left side of the park, and the Lakeshore State Park across the water basin. And here is another perspective view again of the Lakeshore State Park and the Children's Zone area. The Lakeshore State Park was built in 2007 to attract urban wildlife, especially with its perfect location along the Oak Leaf Trail in Lake Michigan. Today, it is much more of a human attraction than home to wildlife. The Henry Meyer Festival grounds have been around for more than 100 years. The site has a rich history from starting as a train station in the 1900s to the Maitland Airport in 1927, later becoming the Nike missile site in 1956, and eventually home to the Summerfest grounds in 1968. Unfortunately today, 9 out of the 12 months of the year, it sits vacant, which is a missed opportunity with its location along Lake Michigan. Located in the Henry Meyer Festival grounds currently sits a lackluster Children's Zone area, which is not utilized as much as it could be. This thesis looks at how to redesign the Children's Zone area and create an educational experience and new definition of play by creating a connection between the Children's Zone area and the Lakeshore State Park. To begin the research, verbs that describe both human and animal behavior associated with play were studied and collected. From the chosen verbs, different objects were sketched and defined based on how they would be used by humans of different age groups as well as wildlife. The verbs that were deemed most successful based on how well they incorporated both human and animal interactions were further developed and evaluated based on how the type of play may shift in correspondence to the season and time of day. This was done to ensure the site would be utilized daily and seasonally, whether it be by humans or wildlife. Many different types of species of wildlife can be found around the site, but only 9 species were chosen to design for based on current or future needs for their survival in urban cities. The list of species includes the red fox, the great horned and snowy owl, the groundhog, mink, fish and birds of many species, the big and little brown bat, fireflies, and bees. After deciding on these 9 species, their ecology cycles were studied to observe how each would affect and interact with the other species in the site. To continue this research, an energy flow diagram was created to inform how these species may move and inhabit the site. I then further studied the ecology of the site, more specific to the design of the objects and landscape. Design choices were made based on the flow of the movement of each species and their relationship to the site. Throughout the site, 6 play objects can be found, including the rolling mounds, the observation tower, the elevated path, the bat and owl towers, the pavilion, and the educational center. The rolling mounds are created around the entirety of the site as the landscape. The mounds grow in elevation throughout the site, rising the highest in the back right corner where the education center is located under. These mounds are made up of different layers that create a different experience and use as they are passed by. The different layers consist of grass, sand, dirt, concrete, and glazing. The grass influences human and animal play and habitat for foxes. The sand and dirt create groundhog and mink habitat, and the concrete and glazing denote of the education center below the topography. The mounds can be used for play by both humans and wildlife. The observation tower is used to overlook the site, Lake Michigan, and the Lakeshore State Park, creating views that are both educational and picturesque. The observation tower also creates living walls for plants and birds with a blooming garden within the walls of each floor. These gardens influence habitat and seed disbursement by birds throughout the site. The observation tower was designed to imitate a tree to blend into the site. The legs of the tower resemble the trunks and branches, while each floor can be thought of as the crown of a tree. The form of each floor is also irregular and fluid, much like the topography below it. The legs of the tower extend into the water below and are covered in vegetation, which help create habitat. The legs are also made out of wood, which will help attract an array of fish. A rich aquatic life within the water basin promotes healthy underwater vegetation, as well as fishing opportunities for those visiting. And similar to the observation tower, the elevated path creates views above the site, whether it be utilized by humans or wildlife. The design of this path was influenced by the organic nature of Lake Michigan, which the site is situated on. The elevated path also connects to the Lakeshore State Park, which benefits the children at the Education Center to ensure a quick and safe navigation to and from the park. It is also a necessary connection point to help encourage wildlife to travel this path instead of nearby roadways. The elevated path will be supported by the surrounding trees that currently inhabit the site, as well as additional trees planted in the bat and owl towers. Located within the path is a 500 square foot netting structure. This structure acts as a trampoline for activity in the daytime, but will also serve as a relaxation spot. This spot may be used at nighttime, especially during concerts under the pavilion. This will provide a place to relax and listen to music filling the park. Along with the trees being used as structure to the elevated path, the bat and owl tower will help support the path in specific areas. The bat and owl tower is designed to inhabit bats through 6-inch vertical openings. Big and little brown bats, specifically found on this site, are commonly found in the walls of a home, and this tower will mimic the same layering effect found in the cavities of a wall. The top of the tower is designed to inhabit the owl, which resembles a recess in a tree where owls are most commonly found. This tower also allows for human interaction underneath it. Each tower has a shape that is unique to one another, but all feature the same bent and twisted look. The shape of the tower allows for a stable structure for the elevated path and helps blend the tower with the surrounding trees. The pavilion is created above the entrance of the site and continued throughout the path to create a whimsical experience with plant and flower growth above. It also leads to the stage pavilion in the back of the site. Parts of the pavilion will span nest-like twine that allows birds to inhabit the space, which also encourage plant growth on both sides of the site. The pavilion was designed to mimic the bending and falling of trees that often provide habitat in the wild. Specifically at the entrance, there are 2 gardens on each side of the path. The spanning of the pavilion also above helps birds fertilize both sides of the garden. The garden will also be surrounded by natural wood, which creates habitat for fireflies and bees. Both of these species, in return, promote a healthy garden. Students at the Educational Center will benefit by learning about the ecosystem of a garden and the wildlife and species that inhabit it. Today, there is a current plan to add an educational center on the Lakeshore State Park. This park is already limited on native grasses, so including the center on the wild play site will create more space for habitat at Lakeshore State Park. The Education Center is located on the south end of the site, under the rolling mounds. Having the center pushed underground allows for use on top, which grants more space that may be used for play and habitat. The form of the Education Center was influenced by the topography above. Moments of glazing are also included in the mounds layers to allow in light, which influenced where the programs were located in the Educational Center. As well as entries within the mounds, there will also be back entries which will be able to be seen and peel up from the sidewalk view on the right side of the festival grounds. The Education Center will host students on school trips and weekend activities for park visitors. Those at the Educational Center will get the opportunity to learn about wildlife in their native habitat and be able to be an active participant to nature. Workshops and galleries will also be hosted by the Educational Center that will be available to those of all ages. Another important aspect to this project is to really understand the perspective of the wildlife that is inhabiting the park. So down here, you will find a perspective of each of the chosen species and what it would be like to experience the site through their eyes. I've also attached an accompanying audio to help you further place yourself in their perspective. I will briefly take you through these, but I do invite you to further explore them on your own for better image quality.
Teenage wedding and the old folks wished them well.
Designing for both wildlife and humans is important to bring visibility and awareness to urban wildlife, not only because it benefits them, but it also benefits humans. Incorporating wildlife habitat and design will be the future for maintaining a healthy and balanced ecosystem as urban cities continue to grow. I now invite you to take a few minutes to further explore this website on your own for better image quality, but I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Brittany. Great presentation.
Thank you.
I was chair of Brittany's thesis committee, and Chris Cornelius and Jennifer Current were also on the committee. We'll kind of sit in the background and maybe interject some comments here and there, but we open it up to questions and comments from our esteemed critics. Thank you.
So should I just jump in here? Wow, there's a lot going on here, Brittany.
There is a lot going on.
I guess I'll just jump in because I went through the school when it was still a 3.5-year program. So I came from German language, literature, and psychology, and then and was dragged through the mud there. So I sort of have an affinity, I think, to what you're doing. One question I have, and because I know the area, and I probably also played there when I was younger.
Yeah.
And I understood where all this is at. But the one thing I'm curious about is this something that's open to the public outside of the park?
Yes.
The Henry Meyer Park? It is.
Yes.
Okay. And then we approach that then from the north, and then we can sort of wind down through all the bridges and things that are there at the moment. No?
Correct.
Okay. I mean, like I said, there's a lot going on here. I didn't realize that there was this much wildlife down there. Is that something that's sort of a given that you're trying to accommodate, or is that something that you're hoping to initiate with the project?
So I actually met with the DNR about this site and talked with them about, because I found early on in my research, I found that there was so many species of wildlife that were supposed to be down in this area. And I was actually questioning the same thing, like, are these animals actually down here? Because I don't know if for those of you who haven't seen the Lakeshore State Park, it's basically just open field with one tree, which is funny that they consider it a habitat for a lot of wildlife that is out there right now. And after meeting with the DNR, they said that all those animals can be found out there, but they're all living in incorrect habitats right now for them. So they're all just living within the rocks. Like even the foxes are all just living in the rocks that are down there. So I think that further inspired me to create this and give them a better habitat for what they're equipped for.
Okay. And I mean, I've been down there with my kids every once in a while when we're there in the summer visiting my parents, but is there that much going on, for example, throughout the seasons? I mean, I imagine in spring and of course in the summer and in the fall, there's a lot going on. Is there a lot going on, for example, in the winter? Is that a season that's a little bit more, that's maybe left over, where the area is more left over to the animals, or are there things that go on down there at that period of time during the year?
Yeah, so currently nothing happens down there, which is also another inspiration for this project, just because it is a site that sits there and only really is utilized when all the festivals are going on in the summer. So then creating this site where it does create opportunities for winter activities, like for example, within the rolling mounds, those could be used for winter play. But I think even just creating the habitat for the animals helps utilize the site on the other times, like for winter example, when it's not being utilized.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. I think, pardon me, interesting is always a loaded word. Yeah, I find it really, find it fascinating because, of course, urban areas and green areas, and especially down there in that area, it's been developed or is being developed at the moment quite a bit. Right. I mean, I've seen a lot going on from ideas for new towers worked out through, I think it was some of the students from some of the local trade schools, up to what I think the couture that's going on there, and of course all those larger developments. It's a nice sort of interjection in what I remember being a very very sort of reduced and cold space. So I think it's nice, and it would be an interesting oasis for the wildlife and of course for the people. I mean, the one thing that I've appreciated since I've been back every once in a while is that there is a green space down there, sort of just before or over the course of the last, I don't know when it was actually developed, maybe in the last 10 years, but that there is a green space at the end of the coast there, right behind the, I forgot the name of the museum, but the White Museum there. That people can go to, and that I've really appreciated with my boys when we're zipping around or doing something down there. So I think it would be an interesting addition, and in a positive sense. Unfortunately, wrong word, but it's like I said, there's a lot going on, and there would be a lot for people to explore, and of course for the wildlife to take advantage of.
Yeah, thank you.
So, Brittany, can I ask what your background is? What did you do your undergraduate degree in? Are you a biologist or?
Math.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. but with that being said, I was pre-pharmacy for 3 years, so I did have to take all the biology classes.
Stuff, yeah.
So yeah, so I did have that interest as well.
Okay, yeah, I was wondering that. I think just to echo what others have said, both your colleagues, but already, it's an incredible array of different architectural solutions, and you're really to be commended for biting off an enormous amount of stuff to design, basically, and kind of problems that you're trying to solve. So you're really to be commended for that. Well done. I'm glad to see that you're being so bold. I think there's two things. I think I would love to maybe hear what you have to say, but also, again, if you had some time in your future life. I went back and I revisited my thesis project actually because it bugged me so much. But I mean, one of the actors, I think one of the interesting things about this project is thinking about the different actors who are going to be involved here, and also at different times of day, which I thought was really interesting in your website. But one of the actors you haven't really talked about is the environment. So notions like, if this is on, you say it's on Lake Michigan, is that right?
Yes.
So obviously I don't know that much about the situation, but you know, if water levels are going to start to rise, what does that do to your site? If summers get more and more blisteringly hot, if winds increase, et cetera, I think it'd be really interesting for you to think about this over the next 10, 12, 20 years in terms of climate change. Right. And how that would influence not only on the animals, but also what you're encouraging, you know, the architecture that you're making. Did you have time to think about that in amongst all the other stuff you were doing?
I didn't, but I think that's a really interesting aspect to it. And especially when you talk about rising water levels, because right now the water, or the Lakeshore State Park, is a man-made park, and it's just sitting not very high up. So that's interesting to think about, even just in terms of that, like if that area could be lost within that. And I think that'd be a really good a good thing to look at into the project.
So there's water and there's wind and there's heat and all those sorts of things I think would definitely kind of change this. And you might need to rethink the things that you're designing. For example, I think it's your pavilion tower, you know, how it enters the water when timber gets wet
Right.
and dries out, and you know, those kinds of things would maybe have to make you think about your materiality quite a bit.
Yeah.
But don't forget about it, because we're all, I think we can all expect some pretty significant changes to occur in the next sort of decades.
Right.
The other thing that I think, where if you handed this off to me, we used to do this in studios sometimes, particularly with the younger students, is we would take somebody's project and hand it on to the next student and force them to then take the next step, which students hate.
Interesting.
So if I were to take this off of you and start designing it now, I would be looking at, you know, I can't remember, 1 to 4 details. Here we say 1 to 5, 1 to 10. Anyway, like very intensive details.
Sure.
Because I think it would really symbolize your thoughts about all this, the notion of how person and nature comes together. So one of your images is of how the tree walk latches onto the tree. And I would love to know, you know, again, if you had 6 more weeks,
Right.
to develop those really specific details, because it's not just about, you know, if you have a particular joint with the tree and then bees will nest up underneath it, but it's also just your attitude, your philosophy about how the tectonic of what you're making then embraces or doesn't embrace, marks itself out as different or very similar to the existing sort of natural phenomena. I think, you know, I'm sure they've made you read Gottfried Semper quite a lot, and he was obsessed with connections. And I think I think those connections for you are extremely important. You know, how your buildings meet the ground, how they meet the water, how they meet the trees, and things like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for bringing up that point. I think that's an excellent point to make and take this further.
I know the architect who designed the Kew Gardens, I don't know if you looked at that as a precedent, but the tree walk at Kew Gardens, and Julia Barfield, and she spent months and months and months thinking about how those connections were going to work. And then they had a really beautiful offshoot, which was the way that they sound, because they kind of move in the wind, and things that they weren't necessarily expecting. But those details for you, I would think would be extremely important, not just in terms of making it work and last, but also your sort of philosophical thoughts about how people meet nature. So
yeah, definitely. Oh, I'm just looking at the chat here. Sorry, I didn't see that was going on before as well.
If I could jump in, Brittany. Hello,
Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. Wonderful. Okay, so the things I really appreciate about this project are the sense of voice that you have. I always feel like thesis is a really important moment in a student's education in order to develop their personal voice, and it has to do with the visual language that you use and deploy, and it's so consistent and really well done and very thorough, and I really applaud you for that.
Thank you.
I think my critique of the project goes back to the beginning, and in terms of thinking about, I mean, it's not just a you question. It's like a architectural discipline question, which is how, you know, there are a lot of projects that we're seeing nowadays that are pushing into the, you know, designing for other species a lot in the architectural discourse and architectural productivity. It's in the ether that a lot of people are thinking about this, and so. It's kind of a rhetorical question, but I feel like what's missing from this for me is your sort of big why. Like, I understand you've executed a version of how we could think about, you know, how we could deploy something that would try and do this. I think it runs in because it's a pretty small site actually, and when I look at your ecological diagrams, it's a closed loop, and you don't tap into, I mean, when you're talking about wildlife and especially birds, I guess some of them will be landlocked and they won't be able to go very far, but
Right.
unless they get on the highway or something, but other ones will, I mean, there's much, when you think ecologically, you really need to think much more broadly, systematically in terms of the bigger systems. There's migration that goes intercontinental, and then, you know, there's smaller loops of ecological loops that happen. And so I think just, so I think that's part of the big philosophical question of the why, of why we would, again, I can't answer it. I don't even have a strong opinion about it, whether we should or shouldn't do it. I have actually, a colleague and I were looking at some projects, and he just got so angry that this person was designing bat caves or bat boxes or something like that, or beehives. Anyway, I was like, I don't really like why hate it? Like, I don't know, but
Right.
is it architecture? Is it landscape architecture? Is it industrial design? Is it some other kind of design? I don't know. Like, it's design, so I think that's important, and I'm willing to engage with it at that level. But I do think you know, for me, those are the big questions. It's sort of, I don't feel like you fully convinced me of the why we should do this, like why this is a good thing. It's like you kind of end up with, well, it's good for humans to be able to observe animals or habitats, but I don't think that's enough. I think there's more you could say about it, and there's definitely lots of philosophy and even Thoreau or something about observational places, and that might change the architecture in terms of more places of stopping and looking rather than always moving and making it such a park. So yeah, that's not really a question like that I expect you to answer right now, but it's what I'm thinking as I look at this. But again, that's not to diminish how beautiful, you know, your architecture is really interesting and great. I mean, the building stuff and the voice is just, that's really that's inspiring to me. It's something I aspire to as a professor, to try and get students to see how the way that we draw and make things matters to what we're trying to say about it. So good job on that.
Thank you, and thank you for bringing that point up as well.
Brittany, maybe related to Jory's question, I was wondering if you imagined this project to be a zoo or a nature preserve, or a new way that we think about kind of building or developing cities.
Yeah,
I think it's related to your kind of position and your attitude about the role of the built environment and the relationships between humans and animals.
Right, and I definitely intended this project to be something that we can start to look at, and how we can start to attach or just build buildings to accommodate for wildlife. So definitely not a zoo aspect. I think that also is important, because I'm not trying to create forced observations for the animals. I'm just trying to create opportunities where animals and humans can interact. And it's kind of like another sense of a project, like we started thinking about green buildings. What happens now if we take this a step further and start thinking about if we can design buildings that can accommodate for this habitat attack?
In that sense, I would definitely encourage you to kind of think beyond, or think bigger about the kind of ecological systems and kind of needs of each of these specific types of animals that you chose to work with. Because at the moment, to me, it feels a little bit like a zoo, like a more kind of sensitive approach to a zoo, maybe. But I think there's a ton of kind of specificities with regards to all of the kind of inhabitants and users, human or non-human, that I think would be really interesting and exciting to dive deeper into. And just as an example, for instance, I'm not sure if you thought much about the kind of relationships between the animals that are existing within this, and what the kind of prey kind of relationships might be between them. Or at one point you mentioned that there's a concert that might happen and the animals are kind of around you, but my immediate reaction was like really loud sounds or types of music, you know, like really kind of things that humans might do and engage in might be actually very terrible for some animals, right? And so I think just like right now there's a super positive, optimistic, utopian, idealistic kind of cloud around the project, which I think is partially your very bright and sunny and wonderful, you know, personality. But I just would encourage you to be a little more, not pessimistic, but maybe a little more critical about some of the moves that you're making and the relationships that you're creating within this kind of ecosystem that you've designed or developed.
Right, and I totally agree with you, Nicole. I think there's a lot of parts of this project that are just idealized, that the animals and humans are just going to be there. And again, like I said, I'm not necessarily creating these forced interactions, but more so opportunities. But I have thought about that in the sense of what animals I was also designing for. Like I had mentioned, I was designing for animals that were needed for survival in urban cities, that needed habitat in urban areas. But another one of the animals that I could have designed for would have been a coyote. And I feel like while that might not be scary to some people, that creates issues for then people wanting to be down in this area. So I did try and isolate it in that sense of what I was designing for. But yeah, I totally agree with what you're saying.
Another way to think about it, Brittany, what Nicole's talking about, is to think about your perspectives, in your website. So that it's not just a visual perspective, it's the perspective of, there's a sonic perspective, but also where they gather their food, where they get their water, where they give birth, all those sorts of things. Like perspective for an animal isn't just what they're looking at when they look out of a little hole. So that you could expand the notion of what perspective means for animals, because perspective for us in our visually driven world is definitely not what most animals deal with. So that might be a way of developing it on the website.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
There are a couple of great questions from some SARUP alums in the chat. I don't know if you want to address those. Not to take the mic away from anyone, but I think they're pertinent to the questions or conversation.
Definitely read through these. So
I don't know if Cameron or Ben want to speak up.
I can read through these too and answer them. So what is the process of planting and developing these ecosystems? So I don't know if I necessarily am following on this question, but the process of planting and developing these ecosystems is that they're kind of already down in this area. And I'm creating now just a further connection and a stronger connection for them to be in this area, if that makes sense. What would humans interfere during? That's a good question. So this one says, would humans interfere during the early stages? Are animals and plants left alone to grow for a number of years before humans are allowed? So because if this was injected in like a suburban area, I would totally agree with that. And I think they would have to be left alone for a while for these animals to adapt. But because all these animals that are found in this area are typically animals that are used to urban settings, I think it would be a little bit different in that sense, because they are used to being around people in that area. Even right now, the animals that are down in the Lakeshore State Park, they set off the fireworks that are down there off of that area. And I was asking the DNR manager, like, doesn't that like scare the animals? Like, don't they go running? Like, isn't that horrible for their habitat? And they basically said they've just adapted to it. So I think that's an interesting aspect though. And then Ben said, were there any instances about how animals can shape the humans on their own? I think that also is a great question. And it was kind of brought up before. And I think that's something I could also start to think about, because I think that could just take this project another step further into thinking about, like it was mentioned, like the connection points and how those now will create more habitats where nests can be and so on. As in not only providing a home, as in not only providing a home for these animals, but providing a place for them to create their own homes. I think that was kind of answered. Perhaps some design habitat for, perhaps some sort of for human designed habitat that accommodates animals' natural behaviors. I don't know if, Ben, you want to further explain on that question? I don't know if I totally am following with the rest of it.
No, I think it was all elaborating on the same question, so I think you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Brittany, it's Kyle. I was wondering if you could click on the location tab.
Yeah, definitely.
And I think maybe for those who aren't familiar with the area, an important thing to note about this particular part of Milwaukee is that the Summerfest grounds are almost entirely concrete. And then for multiple blocks west of the Summerfest grounds, it's also parking lots, right? So there is not much in terms of natural habitat outside of the Lakeshore State Park and this, what I would always kind of consider this proposed oasis. So I was wondering if you could maybe speak a little bit to your thoughts on how, now that you've done this, I mean, I think early on we were discussing in the project, you know, had some scope creep, and it was like, well, maybe we'll just design the entire area, you know?
Right, yeah, right.
And then we pulled it back and you focused on the children's zone. But now that you've completed the project, I was wondering if you could maybe speak to how this might be a seed for rethinking that entire part of the city.
Yeah, so my initial plans, what I wanted to do, and this would be my next steps in the project, for two things. I would like to look at the Lakeshore State Park a little bit deeper and not necessarily implement any like play objects over there, but just think about the landscape. Like I had mentioned, it's really just native grasses right now. And even after talking with the DNR manager, she was saying that more needs to be implemented over there because it's just not enough to support the animals that are supposed to be down there. But also, I think I would really like to rethink the whole Summerfest grounds in terms of what we can attach to the pavilions to also start accommodating for habitat. And I think it's something that could easily be as simple as like attaching something to the side of one of the pavilions. But I would really like to take this a step further and really dig deeper into this whole place becoming a place for natural habitat, especially during those seasons that aren't necessarily being utilized for, because really right now they're just sitting there and they're only used June through August. So I think that'd be a really interesting aspect and how to take this project further.
Thank you. I think we can open it up to everyone. We've already kind of done that, I guess, the questions on the sidebar, but if there's a lot of people on the video chat. If there are any other questions or comments, please feel free.
I suppose, pardon me, I suppose I do have a question. I'm now that I'm seeing this, this, I don't know what we call it, a slide or page. Again, exactly where's the tower now? Now that we're seeing this, for example, I'm interested. You had the very lively sort of rendition of where these things are that you were clicking on and showing us where they are. But maybe in this map that you have there of the festival grounds, are they located where the red dots are, or are those simply the entrances that you have noted there?
Yes, these are the entrances. So this map was actually done in my pre-design work. So this is the current conditions of the site.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But the observation tower, for example, would be right here. I don't know if can you see my mouse on this?
Yeah.
So it'd be right here.
Okay.
So really looking out into the Lakeshore State Park area.
And the other elements, like the owl, where the owls are.
I don't know how well I can zoom in here, but so the tower would be right here, and then the owl and bat habitats are kind of found throughout the elevated path, just for structure as well as variety of where they are. And then the rolling mounds again are throughout the entire landscape, so that's throughout the entire site. And then what am I missing here? The pavilion would span from basically here to here. And I think that's, and the education center is located in the south end corner underneath the mounds.
So the idea is that there's a bridge there as well. So that bridge where your mouse is right now, that would be new. Is that right?
Yes, sorry. Yeah. So this is like an implementation of my design and the current conditions. So it was kind of like a pre-design work. But yes, so as you can see right now, there's only 2 bridges that cross over to Lakeshore State Park, which implementing another bridge is really just to draw that connection even further. And it almost looks like there should be a bridge because of that dip in Lakeshore State Park. But again, further, it's funny because after talking to the DNR manager, so I mentioned, there's supposed to be an education center that's going around this area. And I asked why they wouldn't put it over here, and they said because they need to have bathrooms for the kids, and they can't walk those bridges that are that far. So that's why I also implemented a bridge that's going directly across so that the kids that are going from the education center to the Lakeshore State Park make an easier connection.
Okay, I think let's see if I don't know if I can do this here. Maybe I can. The one thing, there it is. So is it this one? I have no idea where the damn thing is. Yeah, I don't know if I can I draw? Yeah, I can draw. Look at that. There we go. The one thing that I'm curious about is, if I understand this correctly, we can come in from above, right?
Yep.
And at the moment, and we can walk down here, and when the park is open, we can also go through the Henry Meyer Park, and then we can also do the circuit and walk back up. And so the thing that I'm curious about is, perhaps maybe it's a criticism too, is now you're creating this little enclave here that we can essentially go and visit, but we have to know about it ahead of time, right? I mean, it's not something that's naturally visible. I'm
Right.
assuming, with the exception of this idea of the bridge that we can cross over.
Correct.
Okay. I
And
just wanted to
there is also another path, but again, it's connecting back here that, oops, that goes here. That people
okay.
can walk as well. But yeah, you are correct in the sense that it is a little bit hidden back into the park and not as visible from like the street view.
Okay. So is this that line that you just drew? Is that something is that something that's new, or that might be that's an idea to, or that's actually going to be, for example, in the winter months, available for people to walk down?
That's actually there right now. So like as right now, I could go down and walk that. It is closed off, I want to say, during the winter months, but it would be my idea to just keep it open, because I don't know why it is even shut off in the first place. It's just a park, so I'm not sure why it's closed off to begin with, but yeah.
I didn't realize that turquoise line that you just drew was open to the public. I figured that was part of the park and then closed down when there aren't the Oktoberfests and the Irish Fest and everything going on.
Yeah, it is a little bit hidden, but you can travel, so it's basically like you're in the park, but they put up barricades so that you can't actually get into the other parts. You can actually get into the park, you just can't get into the pavilions.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, then that's a change. I remember we used to try to sneak in there when the thing was shut down. So.
yeah, they allow people in there now.
Oh yeah, I see.
Brittany, now that COVID has happened, I just wonder what your take on all this would be.
Yeah.
Some of the most amusing things I've seen is the amazing wildlife takeover of city centers even. Certainly where I live, birdsong is much stronger. The birds are getting far bolder. I had 3 or 4 magpies in my back garden today, which I've never had before. There are goats crawling over people's houses in Wales, and I'm sure you've seen all the videos.
Yeah, definitely.
So now that that's happened, do you think that you would need as much architecture? Do you need as much built form in the park if wildlife are so very capable of taking over by themselves? What do you think post-COVID about your project?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting aspect. So in a sense, I also, relating to that, think it would be interesting to see if the animal evolution changes down here because of less human interactions in these areas. So if more animals are traveling to urban cities. But in terms of like the built versus the landscape, I don't necessarily know if, like, the education center obviously wouldn't be used by the animals, and the observation tower, but I still think there's things in here like the path, for example, where they can still make that connection from Lakeshore State Park to the park. So I think that still is a necessary element to this project post-COVID, or thinking about that. But it raises an interesting point.
I think it just goes back to that earlier critique about, why are you doing this? For whom are you doing this? What's the purpose of it? And if we now know that wildlife can rapidly, it's only been 6 weeks, and it's kind of remarkable what they've been able to do. So how much of what you're doing is for people? How much of it's for animals? And then what's the purpose of all of it?
Right. Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Brittany, maybe just to clarify, I might have missed it, but are you keeping all of the existing buildings that are on the site and kind of infrastructures, or are you demolishing them and proposing your own?
Within like the children's zone area, or the whole
pink area that we see here?
No, so I would only be proposing redesign in this area.
Uh-huh.
And then my next steps would be to not necessarily demolish the pavilions that are currently existing there, but just how to take what's already existing and add on to it for habitat.
Mm-hmm. Or how to transform or deconstruct it, or use it somehow for habitat.
Correct.
Yeah. I mean, I just think this is related to some of the earlier comments and questions about thinking maybe bigger or beyond, like your little site, but then the pink site, but then like even beyond the pink site. And this question of like animals taking over the kind of built environment makes me think of like images that you would see of Chernobyl or something too, like post kind of catastrophe, and like how quick that environment came back and was kind of rewilded. So anyway, and that's maybe related to my earlier comment about like, again, not being more pessimistic, but maybe being more realistic about, how these ecosystems and how these living things, humans or animals, etc., organisms actually interact and kind of live symbiotically with each other in the world.
Right. Yeah, I definitely agree.
Brittany, do you want to say anything about your design process or the tools that you use? Going back to kind of Jory's earlier comments about, what kind of methodology one uses to design. I think it's always fascinating. So, your sketches and physical models and SketchUp and Photoshop and whatever you've been using. Do you, especially now, you've done a 3-year master's, isn't that right?
Yes.
So which is kind of interesting to listen to you talk about your design process, how that's evolved over 3 years, and what you think worked well for you, what didn't, how it impacted on the way you were thinking about this project.
Yeah, definitely. So just in terms of how it's evolved over the past 3 years, I think coming into grad school, it was really hard for me to not look at things through an analytical sense, just coming from a math background. So in that terms, I think it's evolved from now thinking more about it in terms of sketch and design, and then thinking about the analytics of it. So for this project, though, I started off by, like I had mentioned, creating verbs that described both human and animal play, which are these ones that are found here in this slideshow. And then based off of that, I created different play objects that could be used by both children, adults, and wildlife. And then really started to study those further and see which ones did have the most potential to incorporate both humans and animals, and in an interesting way as well. And that weren't necessarily just plopped objects on a site, but instead started to become a formed landscape and blend all together. And then based off of those ones, I took it even further and started to look at now how they would be used at a day and a night sense, and then also took it one step further and thought about how it could maybe be used in the warmer months versus like winter. And then from there, it was kind of between that sketching and then modeling and back and forth. But that's when all of the COVID happened and kind of got shut inside. So then everything went more digital, and everything became kind of I was still trying to form make and make decisions through making forms, but in a digital world, if that makes sense. And then so I was going back and forth between Rhino and Photoshop to create all these images. I have a Mac, so I don't have abilities to have any rendering programs on my computer. So that sense was a little bit tricky that it wouldn't necessarily have been, but yeah.
I think that, again, that might be something to add to your website, would be so you kind of showed us your sketches, but I would love to know how you tested those sketches,
Sure.
how particularly in the world of living indoors and not having tutors to go talk to and not being able to sit next to somebody in studio, but that is critical, you learning that process of your own design ability is testing ideas. And the sketches at the minute kind of show us how you thought about that, but how, like, did you do sections? Did you, those sorts of questions? I think that would be an interesting aspect to your website. We expect our later students to really reflect on method and methodology, really, about going into a PhD or something like that. So I think that would be if you have time to add that to your website, just a reflection on that, and as I say, the testing of all these the formal moves that you've made, I think would be very useful to you, and also then to show people your method.
Yeah, thank you for that.
And I might piggyback on that, because I know in the work that we do over here, we do a lot of model building, and even if they're working models, those are the working models that help you to create and fine tune and hone those ideas. And then of course there's some type of perhaps presentation model at the end. But I think exploring some of those things that you drew out in the sketches in a physical form, and then perhaps adding it, like Sarah was just saying, to your website, to the presentation, to your ideas, might help to clarify a few things, because unfortunately there's graphic architecture and then there's also the built aspect of it.
Right.
And the two are easy to complement one another, but difficult in some ways to let stand alone. I mean, there's always some type of interplay.
Sure. Yeah, definitely.
Brittany, just one quick comment with regards to these sketches too. When I first saw them, I was like, oh, were these done by kids? That she was like asking you know, like what type of structure or architecture infrastructure would you like to climb on, or imagine some towers, or like what kind of moundscapes would you love to frolic in? And so, I mean, it's kind of amazing that you have this ability, again, to kind of dream and imagine like this, you know, through your hand and your drawings. But I think it could be kind of wonderful to have some sort of kind of engagement activity with kids, maybe with the kind of stakeholders that you've been talking with downtown, just to kind of like basically try to get some feedback. Because I'm always amazed by how much where our imaginations are inhibited as adults, and how much, you know, children are really able to kind of dream and kind of create these fantastic things that we somehow
Sorry, I'm in a
can't.
noisy space right now. I might not be able
And so
to
anyway, just think about that
narrate.
in the future. Like it could be a way to kind of gain some feedback and some ideas that would allow you to create and design structures that you maybe never imagined you could.
Yeah, that'd be really interesting.
Okay, I think we're nearing our time limit here. If there's any final questions or comments.
Brittany, I just wanted to, you know, congratulate you on a really amazing project, and one where it's not people-centric, right? The architecture is almost secondary in some ways, which is also interesting. I just did have a thought about something to think about, and that is the bridge itself.
Sure.
Because when you were drawing on it, I began to think about what would the sort of loop be like from the wildlife perspective, right? And thinking about a part of the bridge that was just for animals, like what would the animal part of the bridge be like? In March, like right before all of this, we got shut down. My last trip was to Calgary, and Banff, which is in Parks Canada, the Canadian Rockies, is only an hour away. So we took this drive up there, but over the highway there, they have bridges that are just for animals, caribou, large migrating, and it's just a landform that goes over the bridge. Looks like any other sort of overpass, but it's intended to be just for animals. But to think about, is there some sort of coexistence between the human traffic and the animal traffic that could happen actually across the bridge itself? And then a second point is that, you can take this or leave it, what would happen if the wildlife did take over the park, right? Because that place is empty for, 9 months or whatever it is, maybe more. I'm sure it's happening in small ways. I'm sure there are all kinds of bird nests and things throughout the park, but what would happen if it began to extend itself into the park in a much larger way? But a great project. I like the website too. I think that's a great way of presenting the work, and thanks for sharing it with us.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you. I think that's a good comment to end on. Congratulations, Brittany. Excellent project. Let's make sure to send it to Summerfest.
Will do. Thanks, everyone.
All right, thank you.
Well done.
Yeah.
Well done and good luck.
Thank you.
Brittany, can you stop sharing your screen?
Yes.
And I just want to say thanks to our guest critics who joined us today. This is the end of their session, and we're super excited to have you. I'm going to follow up with an email question for you shortly at the end of the day, but I just wanted to say thanks again for spending some time with us virtually, and enjoy your day, whatever time it is in your wherever you are.
Yeah, it's
course.
beer o'clock here.
Yeah, I'll join you with that. Yeah.
Thanks very much for the invitation, Mo. It was so kind of you. I really enjoyed it. And congratulations to the students. What a relief. You've got a huge challenge this year. This has been a real struggle, so well done.
Yeah.
Yeah, very, very good job. Yeah.
Thanks again.
Yeah, good job. Bye.
Bye.
Okay, so hi, I'm Kyle Reynolds. I'm one of the committee members for Gabrielle Fishbaine's thesis, along with Jose Ibarra and Chris Cornelius. We'll kind of sit in the background and let the critics speak, but we're joined today by Tao Dufour, who is a former fellow at UWM and is currently at Cornell University, Joshua Stein at Woodbury, and Daniel Gillen from SOM, as well as Alex Timmer and Nicole Bouchard from UWM. So I'll hand it over to Gabrielle and you can take it away.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining me virtually. My name is Gabrielle Fishbaine, and I'm a 3-year grad student. I'm going to give a brief introduction and then request that you have the website pulled up in your browser. The link is in the Zoom chat to play the video on your own screen with the audio on at the given time, since it will be much better quality than Zoom. After the video is played, please join me back on the Zoom shared screen for the remainder of the presentation. After the presentation is over, we'll have plenty of time for comments and questions. I invite everyone to explore the website on your own after the presentation as well, to view the images at a higher resolution. Speckled in the Pacific Ocean lay the 9 small atolls of Tuvalu. With the lagoon to the west and the ocean to the east, the thinnest slice of land on the main island of Funafuti is less than 30 feet wide. The lagoon, ocean, and rain splash and settle into pools of water on the land. Sand lightly coats the street, and waste has nowhere to go but upward as it becomes intertwined with the ground. As sea level continues to rise by an average of 3.9 millimeters per year, the blur between land, water, and its relationship to living species is strikingly apparent. If you could press play on the video now, I'll turn my audio off. A Tale of Water, Waste, and Human Trace explores how natural processes and human trace interact. It questions how architecture can reveal and respond to already existing phenomena instead of preventing opposite conditions from meeting. It calls to attention processes that are already occurring all around us and conveys ways in which we interact and can adapt with them. I visited Funafuti this past January, just in time to get stuck in Tropical Cyclone Tino. These images of my time there reflect the aftermath of the storm. Constant heavy rain, intense wind, and debris everywhere. I learned though that these were not rare conditions and by no means kept Tuvaluans from going about their lives. Through the downpour, people passed by on motorbikes, through massive pools of water to the convenience store, or simply for a ride around the island. While in Funafuti, I documented and observed existing conditions and instances of reclamation of both natural and man-made phenomena at various scales. The ability of waste to form new landscapes. Water encroaching upon the land from the lagoon and ocean on the opposite side. And the capacity to throw a rock from the lagoon side up and over the land into the ocean on the opposite side. As I boarded the plane to leave, which comes in and out of Tuvalu 2 times a week, the island of Funafuti was having a cleanup day, where all of the residents participate in removing the debris from the storm. When I arrived home, I began making models from found objects and materials that documented and explored the existing conditions that I observed while in Funafuti. The delicate vegetation growing out of a solid rock form, the mixing of natural elements and human trace that result into entirely something else, or the layering of plastic and sand that become new ground conditions. These models then became the basis for the creation of 5 fantastical interventions that respond to existing conditions that I observed while in Funafuti. Sited along the largest islet, each intervention reveals, anticipates, or adapts to various processes of reclamation of the natural world and anthropogenic impact. This site is meant to be viewed as an archive, a collection of photographs, constructs, and interventions that explore this dialogue. It can be viewed zoomed out, such as how we're looking at it now, where you can click into each individual element. Zoomed in to the particular interventions, or by subjects, which connects similar ideas between photographs, interventions, and models. The first intervention, entitled Eroding Matter, looks to the effect of sea level rise on coastal erosion. This formation goes through various changes. The beginning solid form erodes to reveal smaller formations within. These objects of various sizes serve as urban furniture, climbing structures, or simply a destination of pause. As erosion continues, a mesh structure is revealed, perfect for containing sand and other street debris. Eroding matter is located in the densest part of Funafuti, which is home to 6,000 people out of the 11,000 that live on all 9 atolls. You can see here the relationship to the landing strip, which becomes a big soccer ground while the planes aren't coming in, and the 3 main roads that are sandwiched by the lagoon and the ocean. This intervention was largely inspired by a study testing how water can affect a solid whole and disperse it into smaller parts. Floating Gardens is located at the end of the landing strip on the island, adjacent to the livestock pens. With poor soil quality and water encroaching upon the land due to flooding, the vegetation can be manually shifted upwards. The shading elements are made up of recycled plastic from the intervention entitled Garbage No More, which we will get to shortly. They can be attached in various orientations, protecting visitors from the sun, directing the water to the garden bed and catchment systems below, which provide a source of fresh water, which is a scarcity for Tuvaluans. Rainwater is the only source of fresh water on the island. With each notch up, the garden beds are lifted up and away from the ground, while also providing a visible cue of the impact of these natural processes. While in Funafuti, I observed these lifted platforms where people lounge during the day, nap, and the way the beds are lifted up off the ground are very much so inspired by these. Here's an image of the landing strip that becomes a large soccer field, and you can see the livestock pens in the background. As we journey up towards the northern tip of the island, we come across the thinnest width of land, connecting the southern and northern parts by a bridge. This bridge is the only route to get to the Funafuti dump site, which collects all of the waste on the island, and the many homes that are located in the northern portion of the island, making it an essential route. As water from the lagoon and ocean overtake the bridge, this way around provides an alternative travel path for Tuvaluans. The rings peel up and away from the existing bridge on the lagoon side. As water encroaches upon each ring, water spouts and directs the path of travel to the next outer ring, while looking inward to the spurts or outwards towards the lagoon. You can see here as on the thickest part of the island, you have 3 main roads, and then they converge into one road that leads to the northern and southern tips. So this is showing the close relationship between this thin piece of land, the lagoon, and the ocean. This is the existing roadway. At only 5 meters, the highest point of all of Funafuti, the trees and vegetation are really the only barrier between the water of both the lagoon and ocean and the people, objects, and things that live on the island. The Funafuti dump site is located at the northern tip of the island. With limited landmass, heaps of waste take up valuable area, spanning the entire width of the ocean to the lagoon. Garbage No More takes advantage of disposed plastic and proposes an alternative to sort, recycle, and yield a new sense of purpose on this man-made material. The shapes of the 9 atolls are simplified to create a library of parts for recycled plastic formations, all sharing 2 common edges that fit together like a puzzle. As more plastic is collected as time goes on, the formations expand. Here, these studies are from found man-made objects and how the layering of natural debris, artificial debris, result into a new ground condition. The merging of plastic and natural debris. These are images from the existing dump site. So again, this is where waste from the entire island is kept. And once you go through the entire site, you're able to get to the very tip of the island and look out towards the other islets. At the end of the island, just past Garbage No More, we come across the last intervention, entitled Illuminating Sprouts. As the lagoon, ocean, and sky flood the land, illuminating sprouts emit color dependent on the amount of water collected in the water tank below. This is a way for Tuvaluans to quickly visualize the extent to which water is rising. The wind creates the dancing movement of the sprouts, surrounding those who visit. The collected water provides an additional source of fresh water. Looking up at the sky with the sprouts fluttering around. This intervention was largely influenced by this model, which was exploring how such a delicate entity is able to be embedded into a solid, rigid form and still be able to have life. This project is a collection of artifacts that reveal and respond to ways that different processes and elements are already occurring, in ways in which they mix, intervene, and are in the process of reclamation. It explores ways living species may experience such phenomena. Thank you everyone for spending this time with me, and I'd like to open it up to any questions or comments. And again, if you could just spend a couple minutes afterwards looking at the site on your own to view it at a better resolution.
I maybe have a clarification question.
Sure.
I'm curious. It seems like in the various interventions, the sort of attitude towards the environment changes relative to your position on what like architecture's role is in that. And so I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about how in each, and I just was taking some notes earlier today, but it seems like each intervention jumps between whether it's referential, meaning that it's not actually engaging the environment, but it's referencing some process in the environment, versus like the floating garden, which is about like the collection of rainwater, or the sort of recycled atolls, versus like the bridge, which is like a trace of the changes in the environment. Like the bridge actually allows you to trace what's sort of the environmental impacts on the island, versus the last project, Illuminating Sprouts, which also seems like it's referential in the sense that it's like it's not actually acting on the environment, but it's sort of making some process within the environment visible. So I don't know if you can, like, should we be reading these through the lens of one attitude towards the environment?
So
Or do you see this differently?
I think, so the main consistency between all of the interventions is how they're responding to whether it's natural elements or what mankind is putting into the world. And the response, through the interventions, I'm exploring ways in which this can be revealed. So I suppose each one does explore this in a different way. So the bridge, visibly from the spurting and of the water and directing the path of travel, as you're physically not able to inhibit each ring, and the path of travel is directed outwards, versus, again, like you said, floating gardens, which is a manual lifting of the beds as the water continues to rise and more is collected. So I think each are exploring a different take, but all carrying a similar tone and experimenting how, by responding to what's already happening. I mean, I think my attitude is that, I mean, nature is going to take over, as well as the elements that we're putting into the world. So what are various ways that architecture can respond to this and reveal it?
I mean, in the same vein as that, I mean, do you think that the people here are unaware that they need to be sort of reminded by these things?
I do not. I think being there, it was really evident that, I mean, talking with people, this is their home and they feel deeply rooted to this place. And I know some younger people that I talk to have already started like immigrating to other countries, Australia, New Zealand, but a lot of the older population, regardless of the weather conditions, this is their home. And so I don't necessarily see the interventions as a reminder, but more so as this is happening. So what else can architecture do? How can we make something of what's already occurring?
Yeah, I think that's valid. I mean, I guess my question is of all the islands that I've ever been in, you know, in this kind of scale and particular location, which is few, but Southeast Asia and around there, you know, people are very aware of what's going on. I mean, they see it way more than we do. So my question, you know, it was kind of rhetorical, but I think you answered it well, is just that, you know, I guess what I was hoping for is to see some kind of way to activate the populace there. Maybe it doesn't have to be architectural, but like the next level of like, how do you achieve these types of ideas? And not to be too sort of realistic, because I know that it's an academic exercise, and I think it's very ambitious, and so I commend you for that. And also, it's sort of a very under analyzed and under focused group of people and geographic location. So that's great. I would, you know, what I would hope to glean from this presentation is, you know, what would it take to fix these problems a little bit? You know, like you have the populace that understands that there's a problem. You know, I mean, like how what's the next step in activation to achieve these types of things? You know, like, I guess it was sort of what I was hoping we could, you know, the social impact or something like that, economic impact. I mean, I know it's not necessarily for this exercise, but it's just something to think about in the future. And also my other comment would be, I was initially skeptical about the representative technique, but I think that it became successful, particularly when you talked about the bridge and also this sort of seating with the kids and things like that. And I thought, you know, it's just really important that the way that you represent the visuals that you communicate to the people that are viewing them, they say a lot about what the project is, you know, sort of subconsciously. And so I think that, you know, when you got to those kinds of renderings or imagery, it really helped to communicate the feeling. So that was good.
Yeah, part of the exercise was using the photographs of the found models and photographs from while I was at my visit to solely make up the imagery.
That's challenging. Yeah.
And perhaps, yeah, and I think it's a really, it's a very beautiful project. It's very thoughtful, and I would say maybe there's something about it that maybe even there's a literary quality, a kind of descriptive quality, where you're kind of allowing a certain, allowing the atmosphere of the context to presence itself in a certain way. So, and also sort of bringing us into it. I thought that was delightful. And also it's sort of a bit difficult for me to find a way in to the project, or a way to maybe to begin to critique it or ask questions of it. I think maybe I'll take off a little bit from, I think it was Daniel who just spoke, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep.
Yeah. So there's and maybe I'll frame my question, along those lines, but somewhat differently. I guess the question of already existing modes of appropriation and modes of environmental experience, I think is something that it might have been useful to see a bit more of. And by that I mean not necessarily the kind of practical ways of living, you might say, but even something like existing imaginaries of Tuvaluans. How is this something like climate, something like environment, atmosphere, how does it present itself in narrative, in literature, in maybe even storytelling, or other modes of artistic practice. And maybe there's something about maybe there's a kind of environmental imaginary that's a part of the kind of historical, cultural understanding in myth, for example. Mm-hmm. So I think perhaps maybe if aspects of the project spoke a bit more to those kinds of understandings and imaginaries, I think that would probably complement your attempt to describe, in a way, the project. To me, I see the project as kind of quite descriptive, and I mean that in a very positive light. The way ethnographers, before they theorize about conditions, they attempt to describe it, and the description affords a certain empathy, and a relationship develops with context. So those are just a few thoughts.
Thank you.
Hi, Gabrielle. First of all, I'm predisposed to really appreciate a project that I think struggles with the idea of what an artifact can offer. So I think you've constructed some of your own artifacts, both through the materials that you brought back, or I think you actually did bring back materials to Milwaukee, right?
Most of it was in the process of collecting found objects here to basically construct things that I observed there.
Customs claims.
Yes, I cannot pick that, unfortunately.
Okay, got it. Okay. I think there's also like the artifacts that you're proposing as well, which are the architectural interventions. I think what becomes confusing for me inside of that, or maybe it's like what I would like to hear more explicitly in the thesis project is, what is the agency, what is the role of these artifacts inside of something that we know are systems, political, ecological, that operate at much larger scales, and how any one of these artifacts, let's say man-made or anthropogenic artifacts, the ones that you're producing at this scale, right, versus the ones that you're proposing at the scale of an architectural folly, versus the ones that you found existing there. We could say like the town or the city as an artifact, versus just like geological strata that are now also anthropogenic there on the island. Like what is the role and the agency of any one of those inside of something much larger? And I'm struggling at the moment to understand what your proposal is at that scale, right? So I understand the proposal at a smaller scale. I don't quite know yet what it offers. And I think this goes back to some of the earlier questions too, like how does it move beyond just the people who live there? And how does it tie into a larger culture of image potentially? Like, is this really meant to influence policy through media? And I can't tell. I think that hasn't really been stated explicitly. So I'm a little bit lost on that scale of things.
Sure. I mean, some thoughts I would like to add is this project, I mean, it's very much so cited in Tuvalu. All the interventions and models are responding to things I experienced and observed while there. That being said, though, I mean, I think what really inspired me about Tuvalu is it's a very extreme condition of how water meets land, how the people interact with it, and it's all very much so like zoomed in at a like hyper scale. But if we think about it at a larger scale, even in the United States, these same things that I was experiencing there are already or will be happening here. So although the project is rooted in Tuvalu, I think the next step in this is thinking about how architecture at various scales can respond to like events and what that means for the people of those specific places, non-human entities, and how they'll be influenced by like various factors that are particular to that place. But I think that is a good point, and I think something that I definitely need to flesh out a bit more.
Yeah, I think scale was also something, I didn't touch on it, but it was something that came to mind. It seems like you know, it's always difficult early on in your architecture career to sort of focus on one thing and really dig into it a bit. So I think that, you know, I think it could have helped you to pick maybe one or two interventions and really try to delve a little deeper in them. I always wondered, like, you know, I asked the question, like, what would it take to save this island? You know, I mean, like, what would it take? Like a giant levee around the entire thing? I mean, is that made of plastic? You know, I mean, my mind was sort of dreaming a little bit larger scale. And then, you know, to Joshua's comments, again, like, is it a prototype that is deployed elsewhere, you know, as an image of reclamation and reuse and protection? Or, you know, I think scale is really important, because I don't know if any, I mean, they all sort of acknowledge the problem, but I don't know if they really fix it. So when you do ambitious projects like this, trying to address significant issues, I think I would have liked to have seen it dialed up to like 20, you know, a little bit, or a million, you know, just to see what the extreme is. But
yeah, I think that's a good point. They all do definitely have, I mean, they're small interventions located along this ring. And I don't think the intent of the project, although fixing it would be great if we could fix all these issues, but I don't think that's quite what I was trying to tackle here, but more so explore various ways in which an architecture can reveal what's already happening, but
Sure.
I
And I
definitely
think
do
the scale's
wanna,
appropriate to the place, and I mean, it's digestible for the people that live there. I mean, these like a huge mega project would probably seem so out of sorts there. So I'm not. It's not a negative comment. It's just it just gets my mind racing a little bit on what could be possible.
yeah, I appreciate it.
I'm also a little bit curious about the role of film. How did you see that? What's the relationship between that and the drawings, for example, or not even more broadly, just what was the significance of the film for you?
So my intent with the film, which was made up of videos and imagery and a big model I made once I came home, to really try to pull you all into Tuvalu and what I experienced there. So the photographs, we're trying to zoom in into these different, whether they were instances of intersection between like environmental and man-made elements, or things that were more particular about the place itself. So using film to document those in a way directly lended itself to the models. So by creating that collection of imagery, I essentially sorted them into different categories and produced the different constructs based off of those ideas. And so it was kind of not linear, but a process of going to the place, documenting, using those photographs to inform different ideas, models, and then how those models directly, whether they inspire or create the idea for the intervention.
Yeah, no, I thought it was a very interesting way of sort of describing the complexity of the spatiality of the place and its experience, because to a certain extent, I guess there were many, to maybe refer a little bit to the scale question, there were many kind of overlapping scales in the film. There were literally overlapping images, and the film itself had a peculiar kind of it captured in a very interesting way the spatiality and the temporality of the condition and the kind of interscalar nature, you might say. So in a way, even that dimension of the film as drawing our attention to and pulling us in to a very complex, I guess, set of experiences that are layered, that have historical depth. I thought that was very effective. And maybe there's as I was looking at the film and listening to your presentation, seeing the images and so forth, I thought of a poem by a West Indian writer named Derek Walcott, whom you may or may not know. And the poem is called "The Sea is History." And it's a short poem that he describes in the Caribbean, so another kind of insular context. He describes the historicity of the sea as loaded with essentially historical experiences of violence, so that the sea has this, and it's not merely kind of climatic violence in a way, or the kind of the question of storms and so forth, but it's also kind of the history of appropriation. So I thought maybe that's another dimension that the project kind of foregrounded, mediated through, for the most part, I think, waste. But the foregrounding was, I guess, it was very optimistic in a way. You know, there's kind of optimism in the film, and optimism in letting things be, which in a way is ambiguous. I think. Did you just remove your project from the screen?
I realized I was showing I think I didn't know if you all could
All of a
see it.
sudden, I see everyone paying close attention.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I think I'm sharing the wrong. Here we go.
Yes, yeah. So, so maybe in those instances, you kind of hear as well the project speaks perhaps not so explicitly, but I guess through the images and their layering, it speaks to the wider planetary environmental situation, which is also very much a historical situation. So I think trying to negotiate between the high level of specificity of the place and a much larger environmental planetary space is one of the things that I think it's doing effectively. But I think again, to me, the dimension of the imaginary, the dimension of historical experience that somehow or other would be specific, particular to the population and their kind of intergenerational understandings of the landscape, which probably would go back to mythical horizons. I think I would be curious to see whether that might present itself and whether that might even function to communicate something about our environmental relationships that are very, very difficult to understand in purely quantitative terms. So that's kind of another potential I see in the work.
Hey, Kyle, can I jump in?
Yes,
Can I
please.
say something?
Yes.
It's so good to hear Tao's soothing voice. And I forget how inspiring he was to have around. I think just to piggyback off of a couple of things that he said, I also find projects that lean into the descriptive more than the prescriptive much more interesting, because the prescriptive ones tend to maybe inevitably go to a place that's very reductive, and I think that's presumptuous, and that's sort of especially dangerous in this kind of a context, because you definitely are the interloper. You know, you're the person who's coming in from outside. So, and I think that so in the sense that descriptive is a good thing, as Tao said, I think is a really important thing to think about. Maybe the other word that can then take you from the descriptive somewhere else, and this gets to the question of agency, is maybe instead of being prescriptive, it's projective, right? So you're projecting some kind of a future story, and you're weaving that into what's existing. And I think those are latent, you know, the projections are latent there, but they could be more explicit, which is, I think, where the question of what your authorial agency is in this story. And I think that the use of the film can be really helpful there, because it can get you to, ironically, even though it's a visual medium, it also gets you to very haptic experiences, because you can incorporate sound and you can incorporate other scenarios and sensations that, of course, then can be post-produced and amped up, and you know, you can change and amplify and certain sort of sonic, acoustic qualities to what you're seeing, which could then also bring a sense of urgency, maybe, in a way. You know, it sort of brings you to a certain present moment rather than just sort of looking at it. So I would encourage you to try to think about this word projective, because what does an intervention mean? What does an architectural intervention mean? What are we intervening on? You know, what are we preventing? What are we altering? What are we, you know, are we, you know? So I think the presumption is that you're not just saying, oh, here it is, look at it.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that's part of the story. Like, here it is, look at it. And that's the sort of the descriptive, and I'm going to look at it and help you look with you, you know. But then what is the alteration or potential alteration of course of events, you know, that these moments could instigate in one person, in the entire community, you know, you could scale it up or down. So good work, Gabrielle.
Thank you, Jasmine. Oh, I think there's, sorry, I didn't see the chat.
So there's a few questions in the chat. I don't know if you want to address any of them.
Could you show the island map again that marks the different interventions? Yes.
Hi, Gabrielle. This is Nancy.
Hi, Nancy.
I actually, Kyle was kind enough to send me the link to get onto the website. So I went and took a look.
Okay.
And I understand now that some of what, when it went by so quick.
Nancy, I think you muted yourself accidentally, perhaps.
I muted myself again. Oh, I forgot. I let go of my space bar. I had just sort of misinterpreted what was land and what was the water inside the atoll. And so I just needed to take a slower look at it. But I think there's another question there from me, and I'll just take this opportunity to ask it. And they're kind of concrete, not literally concrete, but kind of not abstract. And maybe it's unfair because your introduction, I think, described these as fantastical interventions or something, and yet they were very functional interventions that you were proposing. So I was kind of wondering whether you'd gotten into issues like the materiality of some of these things. I was particularly interested in the illuminating sprouts in that regard, like what are the sprouts made of? Where is the water coming from that's in the tank? Is it really fresh water for island use, or is it a warning system that the seawaters are rising? So I would just be interested if there's anything you can share about that.
Sure. So I didn't quite get to materiality, unfortunately, but I would love to hear if anyone has any ideas. The idea for this is, let me see if I can. So we look at the plan of this. So the lagoon and the Pacific Ocean, this is a very narrow portion of the island. So the land is constantly being flooded from the water, but also from the rain that settles into the land. So the idea would be that there's a way for this underwater tank to collect the water from both the rain and the pooling from the lagoon and ocean. And I haven't obviously worked out the logistics yet, but filter it in a way that it would be used as fresh water for the people. And then for the sprouts, some sort of way for there to be, I guess, a joint system along it that would provide rigid support, but still enough flexibility and movement for them to be able to react to the rain. But again, didn't quite get there. So yeah, if anyone has any ideas, I would love to hear.
Well, I'll just add in closing that the imagery is really quite lovely and evocative, and makes one want to experience this thing.
Thank you.
I want to maybe just for a second address, Gabrielle, I think that what's implicit here is that this island is acting as a bellwether, that whatever happens here, we know that the repercussions are going to move around the globe, basically, right? And just the first moment that we can understand things in such visceral terms, right? So to be, maybe to be cynical inside that a little bit for a moment, right? Like that it's being proposed as a little bit like a canary in a coal mine, right? That, and I think the project in a way has to acknowledge this, that the poster that says, save the island, save the world, like, is that really the case, and what other options are there inside that, like, is there also the possibility that like, through these interventions, you actually show the devastation of the island and that saves the world, right? Like that's a very different thing from save the island, save the world, right? Like, and I think that the project at this moment is a little bit confused in terms of what its role can be, right? Like my fear is that it's almost like there would be t-shirts that are like, the end of the world happened and all I got was this play set, like this play game, right? Like, and I think, but I do think that when things work well, they're like, I mean, I also think this image right now that we're looking at is incredibly compelling, right? Like, but in a way, it's about the propagation and the dissemination of this image that becomes the most important thing, right? Like, I think it needs to move beyond the island, is my guess, and there's not a strategy for that yet inside the project. And yeah, I'll just leave it at that, right? Like, I think that all of these interventions could be incredibly meaningful, but I wonder if the audience is the wrong audience, and this counters almost directly what Tao was talking about, in that I'm not sure if the audience for this project is actually the residents of the island. I can't tell. I'm confused by that. But that's the way it's been proposed, but it doesn't really seem like that's where the greatest impact can be.
Can I say one last thing? I know that we're running long, but I think that it has to be said because it's so bizarre and eerie and kind of disturbing to me. Like, but I want to say congrats for doing it. Is this idea that you haven't distilled the trash from the natural environment and instead you're proposing sort of this hybridized new material that's like part man-made, part natural, and it's kind of, it really bothers me, but because I'm so used to saying like, like just try and separate the two, and it takes some guts to say this is sort of what it is and how can we work with what we have currently. So I think that's, the default is to say like, we're going to put a plastic recycling plant and we're going to have social classes to teach people to put their bottles in the bin, but instead you're saying like, we're just going to use what's there and make it and sort of show it in all its glory, I suppose. And so I think it takes some real guts to do that, and so congrats on that.
Thanks.
But maybe also to I was thinking of that as well, Danielle. I couldn't quite find a way to describe it, the ambiguity, I suppose. And I think it's there's something about the project that has the character of the melancholy. The way, in a certain way, kind of, there is a certain relief, we might say, or maybe even a peculiar kind of, maybe not these images, but the images of your project, where they become appropriated. There is something, yeah, there's something maybe melancholic about it.
Yeah, fate accepted.
Yes, and the lingering with that as a moment of the way, in a peculiar kind of way, there is a strange joy in the experience of melancholy that's very difficult to describe. So that's I thought of that as well, Daniel. That peculiar ambiguity. The project is lingering in a certain in a peculiarly ambiguous zone. So yeah, and that's in a way that's it. That's what makes it so kind of extraordinarily compelling at this point in a way, right? And what direction you were to take it in. I guess I'd be curious, or not just this project, but your own thinking, your own kind of environmental thinking and imagination. So I'd be curious to see what happens
and also
beyond.
And also just in the future for you and your career and your trajectory, I don't know if it's of interest to you, but there are a lot of hybrid materials out there, recycled materials, and everything from rammed earth walls using embedding different materials and stuff like that. So I think that there's a lot of length on that piece of your study.
We have about 3 minutes left, so I don't know if there's any kind of final thoughts, if Jose or Chris had anything to add, or if there are any other questions from all the others on the call.
I think I was just thinking, first I want to congratulate you, Gabrielle. It's been fantastic to work with you, even though you've really done it all yourself, and of course, Kyle, with your primary chair advisor. The project is really fantastic and beautiful, and I really have loved the comments, particularly Joshua's and Tao's, the kind of trying to tie this to a larger narrative, and also understanding perhaps the role of representation and film, like Tao brought up. The project has been reminding me all semester of just Allison and Peter Smithson and the As Found, and the kind of post-Blitz London, where like this is doing something like it, but in like a larger environmental context. And so I think precisely the question of how does this tie to that larger narrative is crucial. And I just wanted to say that, especially I know you've been doing this now, right, in the middle of the coronavirus, and putting the website together, which we haven't really talked about, I know was in itself a design project. And I think there's something about the collection and the archiving of materials and the way that you began to sort them out, even in the website as a design exercise, that I think was productive, or is productive, to how you're thinking about this in the larger context of environmental forces and ecological disasters and so on. So this is all to say that, and I always kind of try to say this in thesis reviews, a thesis is supposed to be the project that you work on for the rest of your life. And I think you have plenty here for that. So congrats. And I'm also looking forward to seeing where it takes you.
Thanks, Jose.
Okay, I think that's a good place to end. I just wanted to echo Jose's comments and a really great conversation, and congratulate you, Gabrielle, on a really amazing thesis. And also your ability to kind of shift gears mid-semester, because this project was, as you can see from the imagery, largely based in physical making, right, for the first half of the semester. And you had to shift pretty dramatically. And you've done a really amazing job at kind of keeping up the trajectory that you set out at the beginning of the semester. I still would love to see the 14-foot physical map.
Yep.
Maybe at some point in the future, but I understand if you would want to take a break from this. But congratulations, Gabrielle. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
So this will be the thesis presentation for Robin King. For those of you who may be new to the process, our thesis begins with a pre-thesis during the fall semester, and I worked with Robin during that time to explore the whole topic of intentional community. And you'll see her proposal for an intentional community for River West in Milwaukee. There are two members of the committee, my colleagues, quite knowledgeable and accomplished, Jim Shields and Jim Wassley. They've been a tremendous help, especially during the design semester. We're going to be joined by Tao Dufour, who is a former fellow for the UWM Department of Architecture. He's now teaching at Cornell. Great to see you, Tao. Looking forward to hearing your comments. And we have Joshua Stein, who teaches at Woodbury University. And I just Googled you, Josh, just to see what you've been up to. And you're the founder of Radical Craft, and the co-director of the Data Clay Network. Probably both worth really checking out, I think. We're also joined by Dan Gillen from SOM. You're an associate and studio head. So thank you for joining us. And then we have another, Sarah Aziz, who's currently a fellow at Texas Tech University, and she's going to be joining us in the fall as a UWM Department of Architecture fellow next year. So we're really excited to have that. Welcome, Sarah. And last but not least is Mark Keene. He's another accomplished colleague at UWM. He has been recently teaching a studio focusing on, currently on, I guess you're wrapping it up on the solar decathlon, and your studio is a finalist for the Department of Energy competition. So I think we're really excited about this to see, and you'll be able to add some good input for Robin's proposal here. So with that, I'm going to mute myself, and Robin, I'm going to let you take it away.
All right, can everyone hear me? Awesome. All right, I'll share my screen. Alrighty, so I'm Robin King, and my thesis project focuses on designing an intentional community in the River West neighborhood of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So I was drawn to this framework of intentional communities because it's largely how I grew up. My father was in the Navy, so I lived mostly in military base housing, which are intentional communities on a very large scale. This picture is of the naval base in Naples, Italy, where I lived for 3 years. And these communities typically include apartments and houses for naval personnel and their families, parks and playground areas, schools, chapels, stores, even a bowling alley and movie theaters. And there were organized activities for kids and families all the time. But then when I started high school, my dad was stationed at the Pentagon, so we moved to Washington, D.C. and lived in a normal suburban neighborhood. And although our neighbors were friendly and there was the occasional cookout, it lacked the social cohesion I was accustomed to. So since then, I have been passionate about learning what makes a community truly thrive. And with intentional communities, it's their ability to embody the triple bottom line, or people, profit, planet. Intentional communities are typically formed by a group of people who share ideals or views, and community bond is a driving factor. There is large value placed on planned social events, community meals, and chance social encounters with neighbors. Intentional communities are structured as condominiums or cooperatives, where you have ownership of your dwelling unit, but share the responsibility of the land and common space. They also promote lifestyle affordability with shared meals, shared childcare, car sharing, etc. And many of these developments also have rentable commercial space to benefit the community. These communities are often environmentally conscious and can implement sustainable strategies on a community-wide scale. So I looked at 6 different models of intentional communities and drew out 6 patterns of successful ones. The first one is co-housing, and co-housing is a community of private homes clustered around a common space. The focus is on people, and the nucleus of that is the common house. Intergenerational retirement homes are just that, a retirement community that also houses younger generations. This is growing increasingly common with housing students for reduced rent in exchange for participation in social activities. The Tree House, which is pictured, is a community for seniors housing and mentoring state foster kids and their parents. This is all with the purpose of intergenerational fellowship. Co-living is shared housing with shared intentions, and co-working is also very common in these spaces. This is more profit-oriented, and live workspace is essential. Housing cooperatives is a different type of ownership. The cooperative or corporation owns the building, and the residents have shares in the company, and those shares include their dwelling unit. It can be very profit-focused, and rentable commercial space is common. Eco-villages are communities that strive for sustainability and lessen possible negative impacts on the environment. Naturally, they are planet-oriented and ecological interaction is prevalent. In communes, which are groups of people living together and sharing possessions and responsibilities, they are also planet-centric and focus largely on agriculture. These elements that are present in good intentional communities are successful when blended together in culturally and site-specific ways. So my site is located in the River West neighborhood of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Milwaukee is located on the western shore of Lake Michigan. Milwaukee is the largest city in Wisconsin with approximately 600,000 residents. The River West neighborhood is located on the western shore of the Milwaukee River and has approximately 30,000 residents. This neighborhood has seen significant changes over the past 10 years as the area gentrified. It is now one of the most racially diverse neighborhoods in Milwaukee, but home ownership has decreased significantly. Now over 70% of residents rent and 31% of residents live below the poverty line. My site is located on North Avenue, adjacent to the Riverview dormitories and the Milwaukee River, and extends west to Humboldt Avenue. I selected the River West neighborhood because it was a location that could support and benefit from an intentional community. Over the past 10 years, this neighborhood has become more transitory and without a heart or center to the community. During this time, many medium to high density housing projects have been built along the river on Commerce Street. And these buildings were built for isolated housing. Most of these buildings have no community space, and the neighborhood has little to offer in that regard as well. Although there was significant increase in housing, there was little new development in commercial aspects like restaurants. And there are few places to gather or have chance social interactions without going across the river. However, this site does have some advantages. It is located directly across the street from a large grocery store, a Pick and Save. It is also located adjacent to the Milwaukee River and the Oak Leaf Trail, which has over 160 miles of paved bike path. And the North Avenue Dam is just south of my site, meaning that the part of the river adjacent to my site has a natural ecosystem before it flows through the hard edges of Milwaukee Riverwalk, downtown, and out to Lake Michigan. And to the west of my site is Kilbourne Reservoir Park, which hosts community activities like live music. The topography of my site is very steep. The low point of the river is 583 feet. It hops up to 641 feet for the site entry, and then up to 652 feet for the main garden level, and up to 672 feet to the neighborhood to the west. The site is prior development, and now the steep grade makes drainage on site and channeling water down to the river a high priority. For my community to be successful, I determined 6 critical issues that needed to be addressed. These include addressing the street edge, creating lived workspace, a community common house, a variety of housing units, water mitigation strategies, and solar power. This is my site as it is today, with the existing single-family homes to the north, Riverview dorms and the river to the east, North Avenue directly south with the new apartments lining Commerce Street, and to the west is Humboldt Avenue. Both Humboldt and North Avenue are busy streets accommodating roughly 20,000 cars a day. So the first thing to do would be to put the streets on a road diet. This would reduce vehicle speed, add a median as a buffer between bike and car lanes, and widen the sidewalk on the north side of North Avenue. This widened sidewalk would create a nice microclimate to be able to accommodate outdoor cafe seating and increase pedestrian traffic. To support this, I'm proposing a mixed-use development to hold the corner. This would create a commercial space on street level and housing above. East of the mixed-use building would be the common house. This serves as an anchor to the intentional community. On the left and right of the common house would be apartments for the residents of the intentional community. The common house and apartments sit on a plinth that houses more commercial space on North Avenue. The building serves as a wall to create some privacy for the intentional community. In the intentional community are rows of north-south oriented gabled roof houses, a greenhouse centered on the north edge of the site, and the north and west edges would have terraced retaining walls to respond to the grade and create a flat community center for gardening. And this also includes a ramp on the northeast corner connecting the neighborhood above and my community down to the Oak Leaf Trail. There is a large retention pond and several other water features to channel water to this pond, and various spaces to live, play, and socialize outdoors. The main vehicle access to the community would be shared with Riverview dorms, so the existing entry would be modified with planting strips and lined with trees to create a boulevard benefiting both communities. The site, including the proposed mixed-use development, is 1.9 acres. Less than half, or 0.8 acres, is taken up with the housing footprints. So 1.1 acres is left as open space. Now, let me show you the plans. So level 1 houses the commercial space for the common house building, and behind that is a parking garage accessed off of the new Riverview Boulevard. This garage is for the apartments and the row houses on the west side of the site that do not have private garages. Along the boulevard are the private garages for the east side row houses. These houses also have flex rooms that can serve as live workspace. And the heart of the community is one level up, and the primary access is through the stairs and elevator portal to the common house. From that portal, you can enter into the common house or continue into the main garden space. The primary entries for the row houses are on this level, as are the entries for the garden level apartments. The apartments are divided by micro portals here and here, and every unit has private access from the exterior. The row houses are multi-story with internal circulation, and all apartment circulation is external, with the upper levels of the apartments accessed off of the stairs in the micro portals. Each portal services 6 units, 2 on each level, and the common house levels are all accessed off of the main portal. All apartment levels are identical with 4 2-bedroom and 4 1-bedroom units. The upper 2 levels of the apartment each share a balcony on the south side, allowing for additional egress and a place for neighborly socialization. There are 36 total dwelling units in the community, 12 1-bed and 12 2-bed apartments, 6 3-bedroom houses, and 6 4-bedroom houses. The 6 homes on the west side of the site are 3-bedroom units and approximately 1,400 square feet. The east side units are approximately 1,700 square feet. These units have private garages and an additional bedroom and half bath, and this room could be used as a live-work office space or for additional separation in a multi-generational family household. The second level hosts the main living space with a great room and has a flex space and balcony. This flex space has sliding doors on 2 sides so that it can be enclosed or open to the room. I have it set up as formal dining in my render. And there is a covered patio space connecting each unit to the green space. The third level houses 2 bedrooms and a bathroom and a master suite. And off of the master suite is a balcony facing the green space. So the 1-bedroom apartment units are approximately 525 square feet and have an open concept living area with an eat-in kitchen. The master suite includes a walk-through closet to the ensuite bathroom. These units either have a view of the green space or to downtown, and 6 of these units are fully accessible from the elevator. The 2-bedroom units are approximately 1,050 square feet and have an L-shaped kitchen dining living area, a master suite, second bathroom and bedroom, and a flex room that could be a home office, den, or additional bedroom. And from the great room, all units either have direct access to the green space or a balcony overlooking it. And this serves to promote a sense of neighborly connection. This is the garden level of the common house. This houses the kitchen and dining hall for community meals. It would also be a flexible space for other community events. This level opens up directly to the green space and has additional dining space out on a patio. Above that is a mezzanine level that looks down to the dining hall below, and it is set up as a casual lounge space with tables on the balcony on the south side with views of downtown. The top level includes 2 guest suites facing downtown and a community room with large balcony facing the central green space. So this section shows the sun coming into the building and the shadow it is casting on the green space on both the summer and winter equinox. Sun and shading will become increasingly more important for a resilient community. In the next 50 years, days over 90 degrees will more than double from the 20 days a year currently to 48. So the balconies on the south side of the building help to shade, as does the trellis over the commercial space, and the building itself helps to shade the patio directly off of the common house. The green space is the heart of the community, and in it you can see many patterns present. The common house is centered on the far side of the site. There is space for intergenerational fellowship with outdoor dining adjacent to the playscape and open field. Solar panels on the roof of the apartments and gabled roofs of the row houses extending out onto the trellises. There's a greenhouse and outdoor gardening space, and you can see water flowing down from the retaining walls on the north and west side and being channeled into the main retention pond. Now, let me show you what it'd be like to live here. This is the new North Avenue, with widened sidewalk to allow retail space to extend out from outdoor seating. And the main portal is accessed off of this near the center of the building. So this is the view of the portal entering the community. You can see part of the biofiltration garden for the stormwater and PV panels on the row house roofs. There are approximately 255 standard size solar panels in this community, assuming the units consume an average of 28.9 kilowatts per hour per day. Per house with 36 units, that's 1,040 kilowatts a day, and a standard PV panel produces 1 kilowatt per hour and approximately 4 hours of direct sunlight a day. This would produce 100% of the electricity in my community. So this is looking back at the portal and common house entry. You can see the shaded outdoor space and grill adjacent to the entry. And the buildings use cross-laminated timber as the structure and are clad in wood Pradema panels to emphasize the CLT. The common house opens up to the shaded outdoor patio and field and playscape for games. You can see various different public gathering spaces as activity nodes dispersed around the site and the trellis structures over the row houses. The trellises house PV panels and serve to create semi-private spaces as a transition from the common green space to the private units. Water is an integral part of this community. Milwaukee uses a dual sewer system where wastewater and rainwater go into the same pipes. This is a problem during heavy storms, causing the sewer to back up and overflow into the streets. Milwaukee is taking steps to try to reduce the amount of stormwater going into the sewer with programs like disconnecting downspouts, having the rainwater flow into your yard and sewer. But impervious pavement runoff on urban and suburban streets and rooftops is one of the most severe water quality impacts in the US. To address this, my design harvests the rainwater on my site and the surrounding neighborhood to the north and west, and then filters it through biofiltration gardens before it flows back down to the Milwaukee River, thus cleaning the water and keeping it out of the sewer. The retention pond and filtration gardens create nearly 6,000 cubic feet of rainwater storage. This is approximately 10% larger than the site's current rainwater storage needs. So this will allow for the system to accommodate the continual increase in precipitation. And this water would also be used as irrigation for the gardens in the community. The site includes a greenhouse, an outdoor gardening space for food production. Outdoors, there's in-ground planting space and raised planter beds that are ADA accessible, providing approximately 2,000 square feet of growing space. And the greenhouse provides an additional 1,000 square feet of planting. This would produce about 3,500 pounds of food per year. That's not enough to feed the whole community year round, but it is more than adequate for community dinners a couple times a week. So my goal was to create an intentional community utilizing these patterns to support the triple bottom line ideals: a common house for community gatherings and intergenerational fellowship, live workspaces and commercial spaces, solar power and agriculture, in my site plan, I was able to incorporate all 6 patterns of successful intentional communities and address the site-specific issues, including water mitigation and efficient street design. Additionally, community green space and a variety of housing units completed my vision of a resilient intentional community. Thank you.
Okay, Robin, thank you so much for that excellent exposition. What I'd like to do is I'd like to start off with my fellow committee members to see if they have any questions or comments. They've been intimately involved with the project. I just want to see what their take is, and then we'll move on to our guests.
I'll unmute and say, you're hired, and when can I move in? I'm blown away, Robin, and you've met really good requirements for 723 as well as your thesis project, so congratulations. I'm going to shut up and wait for the outside jurors to weigh in, but I love the thoroughness of this and the real humanity behind the vision of it, so thank you.
Thank you.
Robin, it's been a pleasure to work with you this semester. And I have to say that, you know, in my practice, I have a lot of association with the development community. And it's always been surprising to me the reluctance that they've had historically to actually to try to provide for the needs of a whole community. And just interested, like all the surrounding apartment buildings that have been built recently, just interested in just apartments alone and frequently shying away from the sort of mixed-use developments and intentional communities that could probably bring them much greater profits and be much better for the neighborhood and the community. But I've seen things starting to change, and I think it would be really exciting to see large parts of the development community be able to see a project like this one and be able to actually produce parts of neighborhoods like this in the near future.
Sure, yeah.
Okay, thank you, gentlemen, for your comments. And now let's move on to some of our guest critics. I'll play MC here, but Tao, really looking forward to hearing your thoughts about this.
Yeah, so I would sort of reiterate, I think it's an extremely thoughtful, very accomplished and kind of rigorous project, so congratulations. Maybe I'll start with a little bit of a more general question, and maybe I'll sort of frame it in 2 ways. Would you see this as being kind of prototypical, or I could probably ask it differently, which is, how would you imagine the relationship between the intentional community as you've described it and the kind of wider urban conditions? So, for example, one can see the kind of the water storage and filtration system, for example, as somehow or other serving a larger portion of the city in somewhat of a kind of measurable sense. You know, we can see that it doesn't function purely for the intentional community as you've described it and designed it. So how might the wider context, the wider kind of social civic context engage with the community as you've described it and designed it?
Like how would the community work with this?
Yeah, so maybe so for example at the ground level, it seems the relationship that your intentional community has to the kind of wider civic realm, the wider public realm, is primarily commercial. Right?
Yeah.
Is there another means of engagement? What are the kind of levels of porosity that your community has with the wider urban context?
Sure. So I think we kind of meant for this project to be a catalyst for more community development with the street edge and connecting the neighborhood above down to the Oak Leaf Trail and down to this community below, addressing the topography. But intentional communities and like the green space is typically more private to the community. Like the idea was not for this to be a public park or something like that. So there's some perforation with the portals to connect the community to show that there is something neat back here. But this is more of an idea of further community development and how this can be a great prototype for a more sustainable community.
Okay. So I guess that's the in its kind of prototypical function, one might say this becomes exemplary of a kind of an approach to urban development more broadly. So if we say there is sort of one intentional community that it's oriented and structured in one particular way, and it's a successful prototype, and it becomes duplicated because it functions in an exemplary way, and you have 2 and 3, and it develops to form a much larger kind of urban structure. One then begins to wonder in what way the intentional communities in their separateness engage with and interact with each other to form a larger civic realm, you might say.
Yeah.
So maybe just a thought, in that.
Yeah, no, that's my vision of the world.
Yeah, Tao, you're asking a really important question, and one that I think is still a little unresolved. The question of the portals from North Avenue and how do they control access. So as Robin is saying, this is really meant for the community, but what we haven't yet programmed into or thought about is how there might be special events and how the public might come into this. Could there be farmers markets or craft market? Those are things that that I think the level of richness that you're sort of, I think, starting to talk about are things that would inevitably come up, through the process of working with a community, which of course is the missing ingredient for this. And this is really Robin kind of operating as best as she could without the benefit of involving 30 or 40 families in this process who would bring it up. But it's a great comment. Let's move on to Josh. Would you like to weigh in here?
Sure. Hi, Robin. I actually, oddly enough, I know that site decently well. Used to go for a lot of walks right down by the river there. I mean, the project does so many things well. If you imagine everything that you've tackled here, it's kind of amazing. So in some ways, it makes it hard to critique, I would say, unless, let's say for me, unless we zoom outside the project for a second And that's maybe also because it does so many things well. I also get nervous that maybe some of the struggle hasn't been explained or maybe even indulged. Like, and I'll give an example, right? Like, so the explanation of the intentional communities feels like I can't tell what it really offers the project at the moment. Like if I had just come to this and I missed the first 10 minutes of the presentation about the intentional communities, you've explained everything, all of the moves in terms of creating different areas for different populations, in terms of addressing ecological issues, but I almost wouldn't need that part of the presentation for me to like the project or not like the project, right? Like, so I'm confused in terms of what that research offered. And I wonder if there also would have been a way to make that research phase a little bit more specific to Milwaukee and the type of development that is happening in that area at this moment. Meaning, if you had stepped away and you were not involved in this, what would the development look like? I mean, it's that parcel of land is sitting there, and in some ways it feels kind of fallow. It looks like, I think there are some single-family residential houses there right now that would maybe be demoed for this, but just a few. Is that correct?
Yeah, 2.
And it doesn't. It's open space, but it certainly doesn't feel like a public park at the moment, right? Like, so, but I think I can't tell if something like this would kind of occur naturally over time anyway, like given the kind of momentum of the real estate market. And I think maybe that's where I would love to see like what you're bringing to this with the intentional community in terms of how that sets this parcel apart from what might be done otherwise. And then I think like Hal's question about the civic nature of the project also feels like maybe an outgrowth of that. The one example that you gave of the military base or that community that you lived in, like I have a huge, for me, it's a huge disconnect as to how that as an example or a model would make sense on this site in Milwaukee. Right? To me, I don't get it. For you, you might get it, right? Like, but that part of the research, I think, is actually what would be exciting for me, is to say like, okay, these are the aspects of intentional design that might fundamentally change the way we think about the civic nature of the city. Because it does seem like you talk about that a little bit right at the beginning of your presentation, but then it does get a little bit lost when we get into just the specifics of all of the good moves that I think you've done, but that don't necessarily answer the question in a larger way about what this means for the city.
Yeah, and I think more what my studies in intentional communities were in the different models. Many of them, like eco-villages and communes, are typically more rural, and then co-living and housing cooperatives are more like urban addresses. But then in typical development, this green space just wouldn't happen. It's usually about highest density in the area to be more profitable. So I was trying to merge the different patterns in these like rural and urban areas to promote a strong urban community.
And I would just add that when Robin added that bit about her own experience growing up in an intentional community that came about rather late, I asked her, and usually I would ask students this a little bit earlier in the process, but I said, well, why did you want to do this kind of project? And she told me about her experience, and I said, you know what, put that in. Because I think you know something about living on in an intentional community that maybe a lot of other folks haven't experienced. I'd also say that one of the conversations that we've had, and this relates to Jim Shields' earlier comment, is that to think about presenting this as a developer, not as an architect, but to come into a city and to propose a different vision. This Milwaukee isn't Davis, California. It might happen a little bit more naturally there, Milwaukee needs a push, but I think Jim Shields is correct that there is some movement, and we need some leadership. And architects are really good at coming up with these visions. The missing ingredient probably in a lot of our educations is that we don't understand the development process. And so I think this was really intended as the audience might well be the city, the community, and to present this. Co-housing or these sorts of things the market hasn't really taken off yet, but this is certainly an alternative vision. Why don't we move on to Dan? Would you like to weigh in?
Happy to. Quick question. Where did you live in DC?
Fairfax, Virginia.
Yeah, cool. I went to Oakton High School. So.
Oh, Woodson.
Oh, really? Nice. Yeah. I lived there for 21 years in Northern Virginia, so I'm very familiar with that area. I thought that, I don't know if you've taken a class in presenting or if if you've practiced that a lot, but it was every time I hear a presentation, I like to learn something. I feel like it's basically you teaching me about your project. And you did that exceptionally well. It was concise, it wasn't wordy, you hit the highlights, and I always say when I present, see what you say and say what you see. So you only spoke about what was on the screen, and that keeps the viewer engaged. And you supplemented everything, sort of your architectural moves with data points, which I think is also pretty helpful. So there was sort of no questioning why it would be valid. I particularly liked that you mentioned that you had lived in one of these communities. I think that it lended credence to your vision and also allowed me to trust that you knew what you were talking about more at the beginning, so I thought all of that was seamless. I do agree with Joshua though that the resistance here is not necessarily evident. What challenges that you can thwarted in order to get here. I think I would have liked to have heard a little bit about the pain, as not just all sort of the positives, but that's just me. I mean, typically developers and clients don't like to hear about the pain points, but I think that what is lacking, again, to parrot what others have said, is something like this. We're all believers. It seems cool. I'd live there, sure, but why don't we see more communities like this? I think that's a huge question that's sort of under addressed in this presentation. I would have liked to have seen more rigorous research into the other communities as well around, and I can tell you why. It's just not as economically profitable as the others, right? So how, as an architect, can you that's sort of equal to, or if not, take precedent over a lot of the other reasons why we don't see more of this. And so it's sort of, in academia, I know it's not super important, but the only reason I touch on that is because it's been so developed and so articulated in so many different ways that to me seems, like Brian was saying, the developer aspect of it is critical. What's the value add for them? Is basically, unfortunately, that and salesmanship is basically what architecture in unless you're my old employer and an artist, it doesn't. You have to address those things. So all that being said, I think it was a fantastic presentation. You ended on a sort of overall rendering, which is always great. I also say, start strong, end strong, which you did. The only thing I would say architecturally is, because it is academia, I know this is an ambitious project in its sort of conception, but I found myself needing a little bit more ambition, maybe architecturally, and maybe that's my sort of, past formal nature or formal history of architecture. But I think you could push it. This is all very easily digestible. You've made it so, but I think some more romance in the actual architectural expression could could help to enhance the romance of the idea of the community.
Yeah.
I think that's a great comment. One of the observations that I have from working with thesis students over the years is that when they attempt to take on a complicated project like this, big site, lots of different components, and they're trying to think like civil engineers and architects and landscape architects. It's not stuff that we really teach in class. It's not to say that students can't absorb some of that, but in the heat of the battle of a thesis project, it is really difficult to kind of pick and choose. Robin was really good at picking and choosing her battles,
Yeah,
so that she could present, so she could, land this plane very safely and convincingly. But it's a really good point, and she knows sort of where those particular parts are. I'd also just add that in presenting something like this, she did so much prep work and trial and error. A lot of that is left on the cutting room floor.
Oh, sure.
And I'm sure everybody can appreciate how that goes.
Yeah, self-curation is really important, and I think you've done a great job. And we don't need to see necessarily all the messiness, but it does sometimes help to show a little bit of the rigor involved, to show us that you sort of battled through these things. I will say the last comment is my old office did a project in LA. It's called Garden House that sort of comes to mind here. It's a community. It's sort of a block project in LA, and it's intended to create a community. And it's not exactly like this, but it starts to sort of blur those barriers between the sort of regularized housing in LA and the single family home and all of this kind of ownership and community. So something to take a look at.
Great, we'll check that out.
Great, I'll have to look that up.
And then Sarah, Aziz, we're really curious about your take on this.
Well, thank you so much, Robin, for such a thorough and rigorous presentation. I want to start by addressing a few of the points that were mentioned. So in relation to the messiness, I think that is yet to come. I don't think, I'll get to that momentarily, but I'm excited to see how that transpires, because I think one thing that's lacking in the project is the role of narrative and how that plays out in urban planning, right? And one thing that I found fascinating was this very empirical way that you see the world, right? You're almost like a human algorithm, which is something to celebrate and something that can become really instrumental in your own practice. While you were speaking, the project reminded me of a number of other projects. So Ute Van Lieshout's Slave City, which is incredibly dystopian, but plays on this idea of looking at humans in this very data-driven way and then compiling that information into a set of parameters that can completely control the human condition. I was also thinking about Pattern City, which I imagine you looked at in creating this. And then also there's a really great essay on the We Company, so We Work, We Space, by, I've got it here, Sharelle Liu. And in that, she conducted a number of studies that looked at how WeSpace's algorithm began to assign space to people and how people really perceive communal spaces. And what they found was communal spaces were usually pushed to the periphery. And the idea was that these spaces became instrumentalized for performance by maximizing voyeurism and mass exhibitionism, right? So the idea was all about watching and being watched. And I wonder if you can take that same sensibility and then take a step back and relinquish authorship of a work and allow multiple narratives to play out in the scheme. Because I think what you've created is very utopian, and anytime something is utopian, there's a very fine line before it falls into dystopia. So I'm curious as to the kinds of negotiations and the kinds of misuse that would occur by different community members, by people who are a part of different cultures, right? What happens when they converge? What happens in those messy overlaps? And how would you begin to, how would that begin to affect the scheme and the way that you design? So it's either you see yourself as like an intermediary, it's like you lay out the game, you lay out the parameters, and then you allow narratives to play out on them, or you use that narrative as a generator of design to then make small changes continuously?
Good idea. Much deeper dive into the thought process.
Yeah, in some ways, the big question for what we do, I think, is setting up the bones of the project and allowing the messiness and the vitality to sort of show up as a result of the people that actually get involved in the process and actually live there. So things look pretty pretty pristine in here, and that's part of the selling, I think, of the vision. But whether or not the pond, you know, does that work? Does that swan always stay there, you know, sort of perfect? Do you get geese that start attacking people? There's all that. But I think that you know, Sarah's point is a good one. This also, it's just that it's a reflection of how we approach teaching in school, which is it's hard to engage communities and finish a project on time. But that's all very good. I wanted to actually move on to our last critic, Mark Keene, if you're still there.
I'm here. Hi, Robin.
Hi. Hi.
Wonderful job, very thorough, very complete. To be commended for such an extraordinary composition of ideas in our fair city here. When I look at this, I love this last image because for me it brings up some all your strengths there, having this sort of geode. When you walk inside the framework, you got all this wonderful sort of stage set for your users there. And when I look at this image, though, it didn't dawn on me until I saw this view, is that maybe because you took advantage of leaking this out from Humboldt all the way down to the lake, maybe there's a north-south access, which would have moved from your greenhouse across North Boulevard to the underutilized green space by Pick and Save to kind of invite the neighborhood to go through. Because right now they kind of slip in, if you know where you're going, sort of a discrete entrance, as opposed to being sort of more of a public awareness. And then that got me thinking that when I saw your section, that this is really designed for a more moderate climate where you're protecting people. You mentioned by the heat gain in future years, you want to create shade and privacy. And so the summer azimuth is great because you're going to have solar protection by your 3-story building. I think if you look at like what COVID's doing for people now, as soon as there's a 62-degree day, everybody's out walking in the sunlight. You just really need that in Milwaukee from November through May, it seems like, that we have to have solar gain, even though it might be beastly hot in the summer. So then I was thinking sort of planning-wise, maybe your open space where the 5 umbrellas are now could be flipped with the growing space, which also led me to thinking maybe the growing space is too formulaic to say, here's the indoor, here's the outdoor, where you probably grow the same amount of food if you just grew it vertically. Just put everything in the green box and make it 3 stories tall and just have a rotating plant grid. And that way you can sort of just green the whole interior there with your waterway. Which then, you know, Sarah had a great point about the authorship here, which is another thing kind of dawned on me, is that you are so driven to solve everything here completely that I wonder if you eliminate creativity by the people themselves. Like where's our neutral? In your great portrait here, maybe in a sense, sometimes the artist has to be stopped to just invite people to explore on their own and make on their own. So it's lovely that you have designed at this point, but maybe maybe the benefit here is when the developer comes, they'll have to strip away things, and it might even make it a stronger scheme to neutralize some parts.
Yeah, interesting.
Does that make sense at all?
Yeah.
And then a couple things I'd say just about, I love how you hit the nexus, you know, energy, food, and water. You got them all covered to the highest degree I've seen in years here at SARUP. It's super terrific there. I wonder though if the next step, it wouldn't take very far at all, is again, like the gentleman who mentioned, let's talk about the architecture a little bit, I think take one unit and do a great wall section for it. And you sort of be done in terms of not just supplying energy, but not using as much energy here as well. Because you could stake your flag there too with a great wall section on one of the units and say that's sort of prototypical. That'd be pretty simple to do too. And one little detail, I don't want to keep picking because it's just a wonderful scheme, but it's drawn so well, it brings some things to light. Is if you look at the first floor of all those units, you're not going to get people who want to live in sort of an aquarium there where they have floor to ceiling glazing with the general public right outside, because there's no social sort of pathological separation between the outside person and the people inside their private space. There's no level change. So it makes it a little bit difficult on those lower units across your whole space. It sort of seems like it opens them up to the garden, but it kind of breaks down their defense mechanism psychologically to see somebody outside their unit at the same head height. That's why most residential spaces are above the street level outside. And that's just kind of a detail by building out the base and your architecture kind of solve that. So I really don't want to say there's stuff wrong with this, but it's just a matter of when you render this well, it just opens up to how we can sort of tweak it and fine tune it. But it's a great, great project. Congratulations.
Yeah. Oh, I was just going to say, I'm sorry, Robin, I'm about to step. Oh, I was just going to say, Mark, that's a great comment. We've been looking at Leupold Jablonski's Madison co-housing, where you can really see where he struggled with this question of common space and interior space. Sorry for the echo. But it's a great example of what you're talking about. Really subtle work. Are there other comments?
One of the things that we did discuss on the committee was trying to bring some additional, let's call them student apartments or micro units that worked in association with the 8 townhouse units. And, I think you have that potential, but only on the lower level of the units on the left. And I don't think any of that potential exists up here in this green. And I think it's still a good idea to be introducing some teeny little lower income like student apartments here, where those people might have had just a bedroom and a bathroom and actually could use the kitchen and living space, either the unit they're in or of the commons across the way. And I think it could address some of the criticism or ideas that Tao had brought forward and some of the other critics as well. That is, I think the worst case here would be that this becomes a gated community where, the developer and the owners here, they said, oh, we're shutting the neighborhood out and we're going to build gates with security only access. Having little micro units, like 8 of them up here, and the comings and goings of college students and their friends really, could bring actual lifeblood of the community into this place somehow. And I think the other idea that maybe there's a farmer's market or a craft market in here, or at least on a Saturday, the community is somehow invited in. I think Aziz also described the potential of a utopian project to veer into a dystopian world. And I think to the extent it would become truly gated, that is a really dystopian vision. And so trying to find ways to subvert that or prevent it would be a nice touch on this project.
To that point, I mean, one thing that's also interesting is the fact that you have potential to create all kinds of alternative economic models, right? So the farmers market, it immediately makes me think of a very particular demographic who are on the higher end of the socioeconomic spectrum, right? And you mentioned that I think it was 31% of the River West community is below the poverty line. So I think this fine line between utopia and dystopia can be controlled or can be, rethought by you using all of these systems, from the water irrigation systems to these like small allotment gardens, to rethink the economic structure of this place. So it's not about I think one thing that I find incredibly dystopian is regurgitating things that are already out there and just like collaging them into one place. So like, you know, using ideas that are associated with like the ideal like suburban or like urban life, right? So it was really interesting when you were speaking about the military city and how, you know, and this goes back to you, Banlishout, but as humans, the perfect like conurbation is comprised of a cinema, a bowling alley, a farmer's market, a this and that. So I mean, how can you use those as tools and weaponize them and, you know, actually provide opportunity for people who are disenfranchised in the community, and you use them as a way to like level the playing field?
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, these are all really great comments. I think that one way to mitigate the problem of the public and how they interact would be to maybe rethink the common zone, the sort of gigantic portal. If that was, you know, a community space, I think was already mentioned that there's an overhead to having a community like this and space that's not really rentable. But let's say that was a commercial entity, a restaurant that people could work in, come back out into it. That might help to really bring the community into the space rather than saying, well, this is just for members only. Maybe you take the greenhouse and you start to think about that as having a dual function. Yes, it grows plants, but it becomes sort of the inner sanctum for the community itself so that they can enjoy that for themselves. So those are different ways of thinking about it. From people who I've known over the years who've lived in utopian communities, it's not the problem. The dystopian quality of it actually comes from more of the sort of authority of having to work and live in a community and to agree with people on about shared rules. And it's not just from the military, but Israeli kibbutzim are very, very tough places to live because there's a high degree of control over your life. And if you talk to people who are members of co-housing communities, there's a lot of process. And I think that would be my only misgiving about living in a place like this, is that I'm not sure I could take the meetings. But
I do think that that's where we sell short the vision that I don't think this is a developer at all. I think this is a group of people who are choosing to live this way. And to me, the only problem with it, Robin, is that you've rendered it still, it feels like a country club. It's so lush. But if you think about, you know, 15 families or 30 families in River West in their current situations, you know, how could they bond together and share resources to live communally? I think that, I mean, the idea of taking the common kitchen where you're going to spend a lot of your social time and turning that into something that's outward facing, to me feels like we're missing the point of the communal aspect of this. So I just want to defend that vision. I think it's hard for us to see it because it's a very rich community. It looks like something we'd find in Boulder and not in Madison even, or in Victoria and not here. It's a very wealthy group of people who are sharing resources. The other thing I would just defend before signing off is that if you had zoomed out a little bit more to go back to your urban design moves, the thing that you've really solved here that doesn't even show it looks so effortlessly is that this is a really challenging site. And I think this is the best scheme I've seen on it in 20 years. So the topography, the relation to the community, the connection that you just glossed over of the bike trail down from the neighborhood to the river, I think there are answers to a lot of these things. People have felt like it's insular, but you've actually done a lot to stitch it into the community. But I wouldn't sell it out as a communal living space. That I do think it's a really challenging question to say, how do we draw the line between public and private in that situation? But I think the gamble here is that you're saying people are going to live in a very different way than we're familiar with living.
I want to, one thing that has come out that's become more clear since the beginning of the presentation is how much this project wants to fight against a kind of standard developer model. And let's say the formulaic nature of those developer models, certainly in terms of like, what's interesting was that Sarah also made the observation that your brain works in a very algorithmic way. And there's kind of something beautiful about trying to somehow subvert or move around something that's very formulaic with a brain that's very algorithmic. It's like you're almost trying to beat them at their own game. And that is worthy of a real thesis, let's say. You know, like I think, I don't know the answer to that. Like, I don't know how you beat developers at their own game when you're trying to think in those terms. But it does feel like that maybe is a little bit of the struggle that is happening here, that I think I was asking to be more evident, right? Like, how do you actually get yourself out of the expectations of the developer model and maybe bring in a little bit more of the vitality and messiness that I think Sarah was hinting at, and also that Mark was hinting at, but still to do it through a set of, in a way, almost like strict operations, right?
These are all really great comments. We're a little bit over, and I don't care. But I did want to point out that Dan and Sarah had provided some links in the comments. We really appreciate that. So I just copied all those over into my computer, and so I'll take a look at those. I would definitely do that. Robin? Are there any other comments that people have or questions?
Maybe I'd just like to say one thing, just I'll try to be very brief, I guess. I think to me, as a kind of larger conceptual question, maybe, or maybe not even a question as such, but I think it's sort of important to maintain a certain attitude toward the question of openness. And I think Jim's comment toward the end, so Jim, you suggested that it's not quite the developer model. It's sort of, it organizes itself in another way, perhaps.
It would absolutely not be a developer.
Yeah. But just the principle, but you know, pointing to a larger principle that it's, there's also a certain question of I guess, structures of civic organization, in a way, they're kind of ethical, political on the one hand, but then they're also, you know, physical, they're also spatial. So something like the manner in which the larger community, so the kind of larger social context of the city, how might someone move through your community? Would you facilitate that kind of open movement? And in a certain way, it might appear kind of very straightforward in a sense, but just that condition where you interact with a wider public already presents possibilities for dialogue, and that dialogue might be conflictual, perhaps. Yeah. So for me, I think you know, extremely thoughtful and accomplished project, but maybe just keep in mind the question of openness, openness both in a spatial sense, but also in a kind of ethical, political sense. But again, congratulations on a great thesis.
Does anybody else have anything to add?
Just want to thank everybody for letting me be a part of it. It's been awesome. Here's some video for you all, my co-critiquer.
Awesome.
Yeah, it was really a great project, really great project. Solid presentation. Keep up the good work.
Thank you.
Luna says yes as well. So, and thank you, Brian, for including me, and thank you, Mo, as always. I appreciate it. It's really awesome. Thank you guys so much.
Wonderful. Well, I'll just end by saying, Robin, I'm going to miss working with you. This was super fun. When you come back from Alabama, in your parents' house, right? You're going to come back to Milwaukee, and stay in touch, please.
Okay.
I think we need to get get in touch with some developers.